All right, I think that's close enough. Good evening, everyone. My name's Gus Murby. I'm this year's chair of the Board of Selectmen, and I'm here to introduce the presentation that you'll be seeing tonight. I'd like to welcome you all to this information session in preparation for the special town meeting that's scheduled for November 18th. The principal focus of that special town meeting is going to be the zoning articles in support of the redevelopment of the Medfield State Hospital, which I think you all know. There is another article that will be on the warrant for that meeting, which has to do with the funding for Medfield Cable TV. So when you get the materials, you'll see there's actually another article there, which I think you will find is to be a straightforward article. We're not going to talk about that one tonight, but when you get it, there is another article that we'll be voting on the 18th. Tonight's objectives. We would like to first and foremost update you on where the process of redeveloping the state hospital is at this point. We want to make sure that you are as prepared as we can get you within the context of tonight's meeting for the special town meeting on November 18th, and that is also including giving you an opportunity tonight to ask any questions that you might have. And then as part of that discussion, we'd like to at least give you some preview, assuming that we do move ahead with the zoning, to give you some sense of where things would go from here, not at the detail level, but at the general level. Just briefly to walk you through the history of how we've gotten to where we've gotten so far. We bought the state hospital property in December of 2014. The purchase price was $3.1 million, and the state gave us an interest-free 10-year loan, so we're about halfway through the process of paying back the actual purchase price. In addition, however, we basically took on the liability for remediating or demolishing the state hospital buildings that are up there. So it wasn't quite as low-priced a purchase as you may have thought if you include the liabilities that we took on board. The reason we did that is, for any of you who are more recent people moving into the town, is prior to that, the state had proposed to build 440 housing units up there when it was their property and it was their plan. And at the time, the town was strongly opposed to a development of that magnitude up at the state hospital property. For several years, the selectmen at the time were talking to DCAM, the state agency that basically had responsibility for the state hospital property, and had wanted to see if there was any possibility of us buying the property. At the time that we bought the property, I think the driving purpose that united everybody for why we were buying the property was the desire here in town to be able to control our own destiny. And so in December 2014, we bought the property when the state changed its mind about being willing to sell that property. And then shortly after we acquired the property, again, the Board of Selectmen established the Medfield State Hospital Master Planning Committee, which did its work from 2015 out through 2018. That committee put a lot of time and effort, and I can personally attest to the amount of time and effort that they put in over that 4-year period, doing their best to canvass the public to see what the public wanted. If we bought the property and we wanted to control our own destiny, they were trying to figure out exactly what that meant in terms of the ideas that the people in Medfield had. I can assure you, over those years, I came away with a renewed appreciation of exactly how complex, diverse, sometimes conflicting, sometimes just going in different directions, all of the ideas about the state hospital property were. So it was no mean feat for the State Hospital Master Planning Committee to pull together a master plan which features a preferred scenario for development of that state property. And in fact, the actions that are leading up to the special town meeting on the 18th of November really are designed to support us moving ahead in the direction of that preferred scenario. At the end of 2018, I guess it would have been fiscal 2018, the Master Planning Committee completed its work, and the Board of Selectmen formed a development committee to take it the next step forward. And the Medfield State Hospital Development Committee has been working over the past year to basically validate that there was, in fact, economic potential to bring developers in to take a look at putting in a project along the lines of the preferred plan. We weren't sure going into it whether the economics were there. The good news is the development committee was able to uncover that there was, in fact, a lot of interest there. One other thing that came out of that effort, though, was a clear message from the developers that responded to our request for information that the zoning for this property should be in place before we ask for proposals, because developers will perceive the town's willingness to approve zoning as a commitment and a sincere interest in actually moving ahead with development. A development of this magnitude, which I'll defer to better numbers from the development committee, but I've been working off a guess that this is a project that's probably $300 million to $500 million in size. So for a developer to put a proposal together for a project of that size, I'm sure you understand it's a costly undertaking, and they need to know we're serious. So that's the question that's on the table for that. That leads us up to the special town meeting for the zoning law, or the zoning bylaw changes this coming November. As I said, there's two major areas of articles. The principal one is the zoning articles. There actually are two, one of which establishes the state hospital zoning district, and a second one which then delineates areas within that zoning district to be separately zoned. So that's, if any of you have tried to read the zoning materials, that probably breaks the record for the simplest summary of two zoning articles that you're likely ever to hear. And then, as I mentioned, the other one has to do with the cable TV, has to do with the change in the law that requires the town to actually give cable TV the money that they need to operate. Here's where it looks like going forward from here, so you know what's at stake. In the special town meeting, the people who come to vote are either going to approve the zoning articles or they're going to turn it down. If they approve the zoning changes, then the process from there will involve the issuance of an RFQ. Sometime, my guess would be in the spring or summer of next year, probably the spring of next year, I guess is the plan. That RFQ would be designed to help us down select to a limited number of developers that we would ask to actually put a proposal in. So based on that, we would select the developers we would like to hear from. We'll invite those developers to propose against an RFP that would be developed and issued probably over the summer of 2019. Yes? Thank you. An RFQ is a request for qualifications. RFP is a request for proposal. Thank you. And if I probably used acronyms before, mentioned an RFI, the RFI that the development committee issued was a request for information, which was a non-binding request for them to take a look at our preferred plan, our master plan, and give us feedback on the economic viability of it. Thank you. If I screw something up like that, please do that again. I appreciate that. If we get that far, then if a developer gives the town a proposal that we think is acceptable, then we'll have selected a developer, at which time the taxpayers will again have to come back, probably for a special town meeting, to approve the disposition. So what you should understand going into this is the zoning article that you'll be voting on this November is an article that will enable the town to proceed with development. But for those of you who might be willing to go in that direction but don't necessarily know for sure that you are prepared to support a specific development, there will be another critical vote in which the taxpayers, knowing what that proposal is, will be asked to approve the disposition of the land. And what that does is it authorizes the selectmen to dispose of the land that the developer would use for the development. So that's it for those who want to know how deep in the deep end of the pool you're jumping right now. That's your answer. If the zoning change doesn't pass, then basically the issue will be returned to the Board of Selectmen. I can tell you that at this point the Board of Selectmen have not had any in-depth discussions of where we would go next, so I really am not in a position to tell you what that path looks like. I don't think it would look like, well, we'll go back to go and take another 4 years to do another master plan to see if you like that. It would be something different. That's about all I have. This was an introduction. We're going to go through and have several presentations, the first one of which is going to be Gil Rogers coming up to talk about the key drivers and takeaways from the process.
Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming to this presentation, which is meant to be an information session to answer your questions. Let me just say something about key drivers. We're going to talk about 4 key drivers that were used in developing the master plan. And to understand the zoning, it's helpful to understand, of course, not the master plan, but also it's important to understand these key drivers. And there really are 4 key drivers. One was the original charter or mandate that was given by the Board of Selectmen. And then during the process of developing the plan, there was additional guidance that was given that helped us in shaping the plan. The second key driver, and this is extremely important, is the input that we got from all of the community. We went through a number of steps and stages through surveys, open houses, newsletters, all sorts of devices to get your input into the plan. The third key input or driver is a set of government or regulatory documents and agreements that the town has signed that existed for the hospital itself. And those are very important because they act in some ways as constraints on what we can do. So that set of agreements is another of the key drivers. And then finally, the one that's probably in some ways the most complex is a set of economic or financial economic criteria that we used in looking at the plan and in evaluating them. And during the process, during the, I guess, 4 years now, we looked at a lot of different types of plans. And one of the things that helps sort out and narrow them down is particularly when you start to apply the economic criteria. But just a little bit about the community feedback. Over time, I think what happened is it started to converge into some key areas that we found the community was very interested in and wanted, and we hear that all the time now. I hear it every time I'm up there. One of them is open space, to preserve open space and to maintain open space and the open feeling for the campus. The second is recreation. And by recreation, I think what people mean is, not just soccer or tennis, but it means all sorts of things like walking, hiking, running, bicycling, that whole sort of array of different types of activities. And that was clearly a very important one. A third one that stands out is agriculture, that to maintain the connection with agriculture, and of course those of you that have been here probably during the activity when the hospital was running, it was very much tied in with agriculture and farming. The others are housing, for example, and we're going to talk quite a bit about that. Arts and culture came through on all of these different devices we used to get inputs. And other activities were important. Some of the bullet points I put up here was what kind of came through. One is to preserve the beauty and the openness of the space, to keep the historic architectural style and design of the campus was important, to maintain the green upfront area where it's used now for a number of different interesting activities, and I think right from the beginning, people were very intent on using the Lee Chapel and some of the buildings around it for an arts and cultural center. A little bit about these agreements that I've mentioned. One is, if you go back in the history of the hospital, these are put on a National Register for Historic Places. This is a program under the Department of Interior. So it's a federal program. And what's important to keep in mind is that most of the buildings and the actual landscape is on this on this historic register. So if you're going to change that, if you're going to modify that, you have to apply the constraints and the rules under those historic buildings. Another is the deposition agreement between DCAM, the Department of Asset Management and Maintenance, and there's an agreement that structured how the property could actually be disposed, and it had to do with some of the financial conditions, some of the incentives that were given between the state and the town. So that's an important agreement. The other is this Memorandum of Agreement. We call it MOA, but that's an agreement that was signed by the town of Medfield, and a number of agencies: the Massachusetts Historical Commission, the Medfield Historic District Commission, which is a local activity, a local agency, and DCAM. And that also set up a number of conditions, but importantly, it set up a process, a procedure. So Gus had mentioned the RFP that we would go through. It had a lot to do with setting up that process, so that's an important one. One other I'd like to mention is a lot of this land is actually zoned now agricultural. We'll get into more details of that. But the area, this is Hospital Road right here. The area, we call it kind of the south section across Hospital Road, or the sledding hill. A lot of people know it's the sledding hill. There's an agreement on how that land can be used. And because it's agriculture, the Department of Agriculture has an input into that. So that there is a provision such that 12 acres, it doesn't say where the 12 acres are, but 12 acres someplace in this area could be developed. It doesn't say how they would be developed, doesn't give any constraints, but it's possible to do that. So there's that agreement with DAR. Let me go to the fourth driver, and that I put under the category of an economic feasibility. And that comes from three different perspectives. The first perspective is the burden or the implications, financial implications that it would have on the town of Medfield. So we wanted to have a plan that's not going to put an undue burden on the town. A good example of that, schools and school kids. So we didn't want to have a situation that's going to put a lot of responsibility on the town to expand the school system or expand class sizes or anything like that. The other is infrastructure. The second is on property taxes, and we were very mindful that we didn't want to have a plan that would result in big increases in property taxes. There's enough pressure on that already. So we tried to keep something which would be very reasonable, very moderate from that perspective. And then the third is from the point of view of the developer. As Gus mentioned, this has to go out to a competitive bid. And developer or developers have to see how they could develop this property. So to do that, they have to have there has to be a profit motive. They can't have something that's going to be a loser. So that one of the things that we did through modeling and input that we got from developers was to look at that final perspective. Let me just close now by just summarizing what I think are some of the key things to keep in mind. One is that this has to be a long-term perspective. You have to look at how this is going to develop over time. And I visited a number of other hospitals, and the time frame is easily 10, 15 years, that type of time perspective for development. But the impact's going to be, for a much longer period, forever, on Medfield. So it's important to have that long-term perspective. The second is arts and culture. I won't say much more about that, but that's clearly an important takeaway. One of the things that I think what we learned is that a project of this size and magnitude is not going to take place all at once. It's going to be probably phased over time. The town doesn't have to dictate that, the developers will, but phasing is an important perspective for that. And I think the rest of them, housing needs, we'll talk more about that, but it's clearly to address Medfield's very unique and specific housing needs. And we'll get into that in a little bit more detail. Finally, public accessibility. That means that we wanted to not have something which is like a closed gated community. People are up there all the time now, want to keep that and encourage it, so it's public accessibility was an important criteria. Now, to give some highlights of the plan, it's all been documented. You have the maps and stuff. Brandy Earp and Lucille Fisher are going to give some of the highlights of it. Thank you.
Zoning, zoning, zoning. We are here tonight to provide you with information on why the zoning needs to be changed at the former Medfield State Hospital property. To better understand the reasoning behind the zoning, we're going to briefly review the master plan with you. You've heard the key drivers from Gil. Lucille Fisher and I are going to briefly review these key elements, and we'll touch on each area and their uses. So if you'll please refer to the map that was handed out. Hopefully most people have a copy. It's also on the board up here, same map. You'll note the orientation of Hospital Road. That is down to the bottom. To the south of Hospital Road is the famous sledding hill and an area set aside for recreation in the plan. For changes that will be discussed in the zoning at the special town meeting on November 18th, we're going to look at areas north of the Hospital Road. The green, which you've heard mentioned, is this area right here in the front of the property. It's the grand entrance to the property, the existing green. To the east is what we have called the Cottage Arboretum area, which is down here. The buildings shown in light yellow there are single-family and duplex homes proposed. They're on the smaller side, meant for downsizing or senior populations, and they're nestled among the beautiful specimen trees that are there. Further up, still on the east side, in the orange here are senior housing, CCRC, a continuing care retirement community. Remember, these are all proposed uses. In dark yellow, to the north, and also primarily on the west side, a little in the center, are a variety of housing types. Housing was our #1 use of these buildings, and most of these are reused buildings. Millennial, multifamily apartments, condos, 2 new buildings on the north side, right up top. Those 2 buildings take advantage of the views of the Charles River and can be sold at a higher price point. Again, something developers may want to see. We included a group home as well, shown in the rose color up top. And then anchoring the campus is our arts and cultural buildings. Arts and Cultural Center in the dark purple, Artists Live Workspace in the light purple, a little further down. We also have commercial space shown in this darker orange, primarily on the west side or in the center of the campus. And the north field, up top here, with views to Dover, has also been designated as open space. Lucille.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about this is my favorite element of the master plan, and it's called, a sense of place. And I like to think of it as almost the soul of the master plan. The Medfield State Hospital land is probably the most beautiful land in Medfield, located right next to the Charles River. And throughout our meetings with the community over the years, the majority of you asked for a sense of place. A sense of place includes those characteristics that make a place special or unique, as well as to those that foster a sense of authentic human connection and belonging. This is what the proposed master plan for the state hospital provides. It provides a place where people can live, where they can work, and where they can play. So I would ask you to just use your imagination for a moment and consider that we'll start with people living up at the state hospital on the former state hospital land. The historic buildings are preserved as much as possible, and there's new buildings as well. And so you have seniors living there, families, millennials, you have people who may have challenges, who may be living in a group home. You really have a cross-section of all ages that will interact and form a community. In terms of work, it's a bustling community. And with that comes a need for maybe a place to have a cup of coffee, perhaps a restaurant overlooking the Charles. Can you imagine a wedding up there? Maybe a small grocery store to pick up that carton of milk you need. Gardeners to tend to the community gardens, caretakers, the cultural center greeters, artists, and ticket takers, staff at the community care retirement community, perhaps a daycare. In terms of playing, the open trails and the open space are available, and people are jogging and walking and snowshoeing in the winter, cross-country skiing, hiking. The cultural center will bring a hub of cultural activities, from plays to music to art galleries and much more. It's already begun. How many of you are going to attend the outdoor play on October 12th? Yay. But to accomplish this, to make this vision possible, we need to pass this zoning. And that's why we need you to vote on November 18th.
So the number one use up at the hospital will be housing. It is Medfield, and that was the results. The proposed primary use, in particular, were categories of housing that the community asked us to add. There are categories that are not currently, the needs that are not being currently met in town. The options include housing for seniors, millennials, and affordable housing requirements. The units keep the number of school-age children relatively low as well. So the total number of units, 312 to 355, is approximately 20% lower than the rejected DCAM proposal of 440. And that will be part of the proposal, and as well as public open space and paths. The proposed zoning is designed to preserve the open space, and that's a very important statement. Our surveys and public engagement showed us time and time again that open space was the most, and recreation should be placed at a premium. This map details our open space and access to it. The sidewalk system is shown in the red. It's a little faint, but, and the trails are highlighted and would remain.
So here you can see the open, in the green area. Let me be quick about, I want to try to be quick. You have the Northfield, Brandy already went over there, but all the green areas, open space, and approximately 60% of the land would be open space. And I think that she pretty much already went over the different green areas, so I'm just going to leave it at that, with that statistic that 60% is open space. So now I wanted to introduce Randy Kargh, who is going to speak on zoning.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much, Brandy and Lucille. Now that you've heard a little bit about our deliberations and some of the factors that we incorporated into our plan, I'd like to spend some time explaining the actual zoning warrant that you'll be asked to vote on at the special town meeting in November 18th. And my objective for this session is not to make you an absolute expert in this subject, but I do want to provide you with an overview of this document, what's in it, and how it's used in the process of developing this property. You'll see some of the same slides that you've seen before, so there's a bit of repetition. Gus covered almost all the same points that I'm going to cover, but that's all right. You know, my wife always says husbands don't stay told, Gus, so a little repetition is probably good for this. The formal zoning language is contained in a 37-page document that's available on the town website. The warrant contains two broad categories of information. The first is the permitted uses, along with design standards and guidelines that uniquely define what can be built within each unique parcel of this property. The second general category comprises a bit more than half of the document, actually, and it is the methods for management and control of the development process. So you have a document that tells you what you can build and how you're going to go about building it, and assures that the town gets the design that's acceptable. Real estate development, as we all know, is a very complex process with significant upfront costs. Zoning approval is an important early step in the site development process. Pursuing development opportunities with thoughtful and comprehensive proposals is an expensive and resource-intensive commitment for developers who typically have multiple opportunities to pursue. As Gus said, they're looking for a substantive measure that our town is seriously interested about developing this property. One of the key signals that motivates them to pursue an engagement with this town is zoning approval. So we're going to take a look at the zoning process going forward, and we'll see how this zoning document serves as the point of entree into the development cycle. As Gus also noted in his opening comments, zoning approval is the first step in this process, but there's a second approval process when the land disposition agreement is finally negotiated with the developer. So you can be very confident that even if you vote yes for the zoning, that is not the final approval for what goes on at that site. You get a second chance with a lot more detail to weigh in. Currently, the site is zoned business industrial. Proposed zoning replaces this with sub-districts that uniquely define the specific permitted uses that formalize the conceptual design of the master plan. Starting at the bottom adjacent to the Hospital Road is the green that serves as the open space gateway to the site. No construction is allowed here. We wanted to keep this parcel open and inviting to public use and to preserve the view sheds of the rolling countryside from the core campus. Moving to the east, we have the Cottage Arboretum parcel where small residential units, single-family and dual-family housing structures will be constructed within this grove of unique and mature trees. Just north of the parcel is the new town water tower that sits on a parcel that was previously conveyed to the town. That will remain a city utility property with perhaps some community gardening and parking allowed. Proceeding northward, we have the appropriately named Northfield, which will remain open for casual recreation and agricultural purposes. Moving around the perimeter, the west slope is where we have placed most of the commercial activity. We find commercial, retail, residential, and potential hospitality uses on this parcel. We did that to keep the traffic from commercial activity out of the rest of the site and preserving the ambiance that people like having there. And finally, we come to Liqueur Campus, which is considered by most folks as the crown jewel of this site. And here we find a variety of housing types and repurposed historic structures, a group home, commercial sites along with a cultural center, and artist activity. Development here leverages the financial impact of various tax credits to allow reuse of these historic structures, and the design guidelines assure that the character of the existing buildings will be preserved in new construction or renovations. The permitted uses are sufficiently flexible to also allow elder housing and care facilities if they're deemed to be commercially attractive. In summary, the division of the property into these sub-districts incorporates all the factors considered by the Master Planning Committee. It delivers additional variety to the town's housing stock while preserving the open spaces and the casual recreational opportunities that defines Medfield's essentially rural character. So let's shift our focus now and look at the process once again. Despite the fact the town took ownership of this hospital site in 2014, we were very much at the front end of the process. The second stage, the zoning that we're currently considering, delivers the regulatory framework that guides the remainder of the project. Once we've attained zoning approval, we can identify an appropriate development partner via review of proposals submitted by interested developers. We will then negotiate a land disposition agreement, an LDA, with our preferred developer. The LDA will also be approved at a town-wide vote, just like the vote we're about to take for the zoning approval. We can then proceed to the stage where specific construction proposals are reviewed and approved by the town's permitting authorities. In the final stage of construction, town oversight will be conducted to assure that the final delivered buildings, renovations, and grounds conform to the allowed and permitted uses. Repurposing a hospital site is a complex undertaking that will require continual commitment of significant town resources to successfully complete. As Gus noted, the alternative to this process is to revert the issue back to the Board of Selectmen for continuing discussion and formulation of a new approach. I'd like to add one final thought about this process. Some people may be inclined to vote no on the warrant with an expectation that rejection of the zoning will result in a no development scenario where the site remains in its current configuration and no expenses incurred by the town. However, this is not a realistic point of view. The fact is that the hospital site requires constant maintenance of the grounds and building stabilization activity if no development takes place, and it will be an ongoing expense for the town. Your Master Planning Committee strongly feels that the development concept we've created in this initial stage is a good plan to kick off this effort, and it deserves your support and approval of the zoning. I want to thank you tonight for your time and patience. I know I've covered a lot of points that have already been covered, but it's important that you have a good understanding of the process and what we're being asked to vote on. Next up on the dais here is Todd Treyubenko. He's going to be talking about the implementation phase. Okay, did I get it right?
Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out and hanging around for the last guy to speak. So I'm Todd Treyubenko, the chair of the Medfield State Hospital Development Committee. Our committee was created by the Board of Selectmen in August of 2018, shortly after the master plan was delivered by the Master Planning Committee. And our committee is made up of real estate professionals, Medfield residents, working in commercial real estate, and unaffiliated with the last several years of master planning activity at the hospital. Most of our group is here tonight. I'd say somewhat ironically sitting at this end of the table, while all the folks you heard from previously are affiliated with the master planning effort. Selectman Murby was also on the development committee as a representative of the Board of Selectmen. So our charter for the development committee was to go out and engage the broader real estate development community regarding the viability of the preferred scenario. So take the work product from 4 years of master planning in Medfield and leave the city limits of Medfield, go out into the world and talk to developers about, does this make sense? You know, what do you see in here that you think is viable or you think is a non-starter? And just talk to us about what you think of this vision and give us your reactions. And then we were to come back to the Board of Selectmen as a committee and recommend what, if anything, should be brought to the town regarding the future of the hospital. So the principal tool we used to do this is we issued a request for information, an RFI, which is a non-binding document. It was 7 pages long. We thought initially we would target this to a fairly small group of developers who, in our judgment, might have the capacity or the experience to execute a project of this magnitude. But, you know, as we really looked at it, we decided we should err on the side of information. We were trying to get information, and we were going to send it out to not only large development firms in the Northeast, but also, you know, others who had expressed interest in the hospital site at some point over time to the town. And we were very clear that it was a non-binding exercise. So we said to these developers that you're not required to respond to this. We're purely looking for information at this point. There may not be a subsequent request for qualifications or request for proposals, but if there is, you haven't gained any type of advantage just by giving us free information now in the process. This is basically a brainstorming feedback type of exercise. And conversely, if you don't respond to the RFI, you're not precluded at a later point in time, if the town is to go to request for proposals, from coming in and giving us your, you know, a proposal for this site. And we really wanted to talk to them about the master plan as a vision. It's not the plans and specs or the blueprint. It's a master plan. We didn't get to the level of how many studios versus 1 bedrooms. We didn't get to the idea of if there's an inn that's proposed, is that going to work in year 1 versus year 3? This was a broader brush. And we asked them about the opportunities and challenges of that plan and what they saw as the possibilities or impossibilities of that plan, and whether they would be interested, where they thought they could get financing, what kind of funds might be available to offset what might expected to be town expenditures that perhaps the developer could pay. And we got pretty good responses. We received 5 detailed responses, which we then followed up with individual interviews, going into these offices and sitting down with everyone that responded, regardless of the nature of their response, to just try to learn as much as we could about the project and their interest in it. So 3 of the responses we received were from nationally recognized local, you know, Boston-based firms that have a lot of experience and long track records in historic preservation projects. The newest of these firms was formed in the mid-1980s. The other firms go back to the late 60s or early 70s. Collectively, they've done hundreds of properties and collectively own and manage over 100,000 apartments across the country. And their feedback to us, and these are specific phrases that I pulled out of the RFI responses, they really felt this plan could be a winner in terms of historic tax credits and other resources that they know how to use and that are available. They were pretty excited about the plan and thought that it could be viable and buildable with some flexibility from the town going forward as sort of the normal part of the real estate development process. The focus really was kind of thinking back on north of Hospital Road. We didn't exclude anything from the discussions, but I think in terms of the resources that these developers tap into and know how to leverage, they're very interested in the reuse of the historic buildings on the site, and that's what's driving their interest. The message on the zoning was pretty loud and clear. None of these developers see this as an unfriendly 40B type project. They want to work collaboratively with the town. And they stressed that the need for the zoning really related to the size of the project, that in other circumstances, let's say a 200-unit development, their interest might be in being designated the developer by the town and then working with the town on the zoning, maybe having a hand in the zoning before something goes to town meeting. But given the scale of this and the hundreds of thousands of dollars, one firm told us $1 million to prepare a binding request for proposal response with plans and specs, engineering studies, remediation studies. They weren't going to put this project ahead of other things in their pipeline that they had more control over and not run the risk of spending a lot of time and money on this only to find that the 2/3 vote required at town meeting for zoning was not going to come to pass. We had 2 other responses that I would characterize those as from very good and successful companies, but with different business plans, not known for historic preservation or reuse. And their view was really more along the lines of, it's a beautiful site, it's not going to be cost effective to rehab the buildings, you should take everything down, maybe maintain 1 or 2 buildings, the art center, things like that, but that generally you'd be talking about new construction. One of those firms did the State Hospital in Westboro, which is 700 units on 37 acres, to give you some idea of probably the metrics that they think would be needed for new construction to be feasible. The other was talking about the zoning, perhaps allowing for up to 500 units of multifamily on the site. Again, good firms, just not in the business of executing real estate development along the lines of what's envisioned by the plan. So we did report back to the Board of Selectmen. At this point now we're into spring of this year after all of the interviews. Our main conclusion is that there are definitely blue chip developers that are local, very experienced, that are very interested in this site. We asked them specifically what changes would you make to the plan, and frankly we didn't get a lot of specific ideas about changes. We had at least one firm saying I wouldn't change anything. These things are planning tools by nature. You've heard from myself and others about the need to change the zoning. Our concern on the committee is that without the zoning, you're not going to get this type of firm for the reasons that we discussed, and you may get firms that are not able to really, frankly, execute the project or do it well. And then finally, Randy mentioned some subsequent steps if the zoning were to pass. And as a development committee, we're sort of on the back end of the process, unlike the front end with the planning committee. And we are doing some work with money that was appropriated at annual town meeting around further studies of water and sewer, remediation costs, other important information that I think we would all like to have, prior to any type of disposition vote at the RFP stage, if in fact the zoning passes. And that's what I've got. Are we going back to you, Sarah, or to Gus?
We're coming back to me, but we're really throwing this out to you. With that information and your patient and quiet attention over these presentations, we wanted to open the floor up to questions. There's a microphone down at the front on the right for you and also on the left, so I'd suggest you do that. I've been instructed if, even with a microphone, people can't hear you, I'll repeat your question, but I don't think that's going to be required.
Tracy Hogan, 20 Hospital Road. I have a question about what you're designating as open space, because I attended the planning board meeting the other night, and specifically as with the North Field, you're saying that it's going to be open space, but the way it's going to be zoned, it's going to be zoned so it could be developed at a later date. And I'm wondering why there is no preservation of that, because preservation means preservation, and it doesn't mean preserving it now and then possibly developing it later. So I want to address that as to why is that being slated for possible development at a later date. I know that there was some concern that if we wanted to develop that area later, it would have to go in front of the Mass State Legislature, but that's one of the reasons why the legislature makes it difficult for land that has been preserved to be suddenly developed, because there's so much land right now being developed and the developers have the upper hand. So that's why the legislature makes it more difficult to take preservation land and develop it at a later date. So my question is, why is the North Field not being preserved?
I'm Ken Richard from the Development Committee, and I was at the same planning board meeting that you were at. And I think the argument that was made, actually introduced by Attorney Sorrell, was a very compelling one. You heard initially Gus said the reason we bought this land was so that we had some control in the destiny of the land. And if we did not designate that area with some potential use, then it would lock it up and it could never be touched without a vote of the state legislature. Even if it were to be ever changed for any reason in the who knows how long future, again, it would be as a result of approval by the citizens of the town of Medfield, not the state legislature. So if anyone would at any future time ever propose any kind of alternative use other than conservation, it still would not be converted or changed without approval by the citizens of the town of Medfield. So I would say that provides sufficient protection of that land and still provides some flexibility for those folks who may be the citizens of Medfield at some time in the future. As you know, the master plan that has been submitted and has been the backdrop for what's happened to date clearly designates that as open space. It will not be included on any our request for qualifications. It will not be included in any request for proposal at this stage at all. So I would just simply say to maintain self-destiny in the future and with the assurance that that protection is afforded to the citizens and no one else. I thought Attorney Sorrell's caution about a Chapter 97 incident to be actually very, very helpful in the process.
But that's not preserving the land.
We understand. I mean, you've made your point, and all I'm saying to you is it literally will not be developed, changed, or altered without the full consent or two-thirds vote of the citizens of the town. And if the wishes of the town are to not convert it at any time beyond green space, then those wishes will have to be, those wishes will absolutely be enforced.
And then could you also go into the 40B distinction and the 40R distinction? Because from what the planning board was saying, that this is going to be more of a 40R development? Or just, could you explain what
maybe someone else could speak to that, but I am not an expert in 40R, but what I heard very clearly was it's not a 40R, it's sort of 40R light, whatever that meant, but the emphasis on this master plan is to allow the town to always maintain its compliance with the 10% affordable, but it's not a 40R.
Then what were they talking about at the meeting with the 40R distinction? If you could just elaborate on that.
Hi, I'm Theresa James. I'm from the Master Planning Committee. I'm also on the planning board. So I'll try to address this the best I can because it does get complicated, but it is not a 40R development with additional guidelines or jurisdiction by a 40R mass state. What it really means is that the housing is multiple uses, and we have multiple use types. As you can see by how we've identified the different types and housing stock options that don't exist in Medfield today, or exist very little in Medfield today. So we're not receiving any additional funding from the state because of 40R or anything like that. But using kind of the diversity of that housing stock. Sarah might have some other good points on that. The 40B is that within that is also in the zoning document is inclusionary zoning, so that we will continue to progress as we add housing density or more housing stock, that we will continue to meet our needs and our requirements in having affordable housing there as well. So, Sarah, did you want to add more on 40R?
Okay, thank you.
And just one point, as I was listening in the presentation, I want to make sure one detail came across. The zoning articles that we're talking about here are for the land north of Hospital Road. At the last Board of Selectmen's meeting, we took a look and basically asked that the land south of Hospital Road be removed from the overall zoning article. The reason for that is that there are 12 acres of developable land south of Hospital Road, but we haven't designated what those 12 acres would be, so we're not actually in a position to truly zone those 12 acres for development. So we basically took that off the equation, and we will address that. That's not the part of the property that we probably need a formal developer to help us with. But just to be clear, I wasn't sure if that came through in what was presented. Over on the right.
Okay, I'm Robert Booker. I live in Glover Place. A couple of caveats. First, I actually like the master plan. I think it's pretty good. Secondly, I've only been in Medfield for 2 years. My question is, why is it part of the plan to save the old buildings? Why are we saving dilapidated and possibly antiquated buildings instead of trying to build something that's more energy efficient and more cost-effective construction? Thank you.
Gil?
Good. Is this on? Yeah. Good question. I think it's on a lot of people's minds. I would say there's 3 or 4 answers to that. I've been in Medfield about 25 years, I guess, something like that. The first is, through all of these surveys and community inputs that we've gotten, there's an overwhelming sense of trying to retain, to reuse the buildings, if possible. And it's because people appreciate the architecture. It's Queen Anne's. It's a very distinctive architectural style. And so people want to keep that historically, if possible, and to reuse the buildings and not to tear them down. The second is I talked about various government agreements we have. So these are on the historical register. So you can't arbitrarily tear them down. You can't destroy them. Also, there's both the local Medfield Historic District, which we have representatives here, and also the State Historical Commission, that both are overseeing this, are reviewing it. And there's a strong preference to retain the buildings, if possible. I've been in maybe 12 or so of the buildings, and been inside and toured them and all. And seeing the buildings and walking around in them firsthand, you get the impression that these buildings can be reused. They're obviously not exactly designed ideally for condominiums, so that they'd probably have to be gutted and redone inside. But the structures of the buildings are actually in very good shape, most of them. Not all, but many of them. Some of them, as you say, are kind of beyond hope, And in that case, you probably will need to destroy them or tear them down. Or in other cases, some of the buildings just don't fit architecturally, and they were added in as the hospital was developed, and they just don't really fit very, very well. So we've designated those in the plan. But I think that the overwhelming sense of the community, of the Medfield community, and I think, speaking kind of for everybody on the committee here, I think is, if possible, to restore the buildings and reuse them for purposes, today's purposes, and that sentiment, I think, is what is driving our opinion. I think you have to come up for the mic because it's on TV.
Plenty of room over here.
You want to take that?
Oh, sure. Yes, I'm Mike Taylor from Chair of the Medfield Historic District Commission. Actually, when this whole process began, the thinking was it didn't make economic sense to really restore any of the buildings. And but there's something called state and federal tax credits that give developers up to 40%, grant, so to speak, that some of the experts like Kathy, I don't know if Kathy's here this evening, but what the so-called blue chip developers, the people that do historic preservations, they really prefer to take advantage of these tax credits. And with the tax credits, a developer can make really more money than just tearing the buildings down and starting all over again. Now, it is true, as Gil mentioned, that these buildings are part of a local historic district, so they're supposed to be preserved at all if it's economically feasible. But also, we have a memorandum of understanding with the state where we're supposed to try to do it if it's economically feasible. So in the end, if it doesn't make sense, well, maybe they could be torn down, but we're supposed to go in good faith down the path of trying to preserve them. Thank you.
If I could just maybe add on to that, I know it wasn't quite your question, but with the historic tax credits, that's really through the Park Service, and then the developers are allocated those credits, which they then sell, and the investors use those credits to offset their taxes. So if you happen to be in Mansfield Center, you'll see there's a 100-year-old chocolate factory now that's being renovated with that program, and some of the investors that you might see are Berkshire Hathaway, Google, Verizon. I mean, these are big companies coming in because they value the credit. And so I think what some of the developers would say in response to your question is there's a resource out there that, in effect, makes it more cost-effective in terms of what the developer and a municipality might be paying because they can leverage that. I would also say, because of the way those investors operate, everybody's looking for buildings to be green and to be built to a modern standard of energy conservation. That's a very important criteria when these investors are deciding on investing in a particular project.
Take our next question on the right, because they've been standing up longer than you have.
Actually, a couple. Thank you, Gus. Paul Mason, been here for 20 years, live on Long Meadow Road, which abuts the property. So I've been part of my wife and I have been both part of the neighborhood's all been part of some of these outreach, sessions that we've had over the years. So they've been very good. I just have two real questions. One is, the proposal looks great, and I'm thrilled, and we walk our dog up there, and we've been up through there for 20 years now. But my concern is over how much change the developers will have over that. It looks beautiful on a plan. It's our intent. And in particular, I'm thinking about even the Arboretum area. Where what's the limit on the housing there and the cutting down of trees? Because too often I've seen them clear cut trees in order to go put houses in. And that kills me. I don't understand why they do that when they destroy the. So that was my first question. If I could just get a response to that.
Probably
Is there any kind of controls over the developers? Or I know there's going to be some negotiations, but I'm just curious as to that.
Okay, this is Theresa again, in the zoning document, which is beefy, and it's a fun one to read, but there is not only the land use types that support the preferred option, but there's a whole section of design guidelines. And those design guidelines help drive what those limits are. So, for example, I'm reading directly from the proposed zoning for the Cottage Arboretum that you mentioned, and the footprint is slated as new construction with a maximum footprint of 3,600 square feet is permitted. New construction should be sited so not to impact or remove existing specimen trees.
Okay.
So there's specific language, and then there's frontage, and then there's height, and all these other things in there as well as a lot of other options throughout the design guidelines. So I would say take a really close read of those design guidelines, because that's what's going to enforce that
The preservation
character
of
and
the character,
that
right?
preservation.
Good. That's my concern. And the other being living on Long Meadow and knowing Hospital Road and Harding Road, I'm just wondering what kind of infrastructure studies have been done around the traffic patterns. If we're having, what we said, 312 to 355 units, I can imagine there's another 300 cars, they're going to be coming in and out of there. Plus, if there's commercial use, there's going to be more cars. And I'm just wondering, what kind of infrastructure studies have been done around the roads? It's 25 miles an hour, but we could have cars backed up 20, 30 cars, honestly. That's what I'm just wondering, has any study been done around infrastructure? I heard the piping and the sewers and all that, but what about the roads? The traffic.
Yeah, let me take a first crack at that as,
It's heavily residential in that
I'm the
area.
least qualified on it, so it's only uphill from whatever I have to say. The one point I'd make on that is that there have been traffic studies done in conjunction with the Chapel Hill Landing, so it's not that there's no road traffic studies that have been done, but from my standpoint, again, unqualified, right now, we don't even know that we have a project. So there's two issues for me. One would be, will we conclude that a traffic problem on Hospital Road would preclude us from doing anything up at the state hospital? I don't think that's the case. I think it's a legitimate question, but I think it's a question that comes in when you actually know for sure that you have something that you're looking at doing.
Well, I guess I'm in the context of what we're talking about tonight and what we'll be voting on in a few weeks. If we're talking about some 325 on average number of units, and every unit's got at least one car, perhaps, maybe more, plus commercial, I'm just concerned about, it's very residential in that area. Kids are out playing and all that, and having lived on Harding, and I'm right abutted to Harding off of Long Meadow, and cars come screaming down Harding way too fast. I've offered to the police department to park their car on my property to try to slow the cars down. And now we're going to add another 300-400 cars in, it could easily be that.
To answer your direct question, I don't believe we've had anything approaching, go ahead, Pete, we're going uphill here. So
Okay,
go on up,
that's
Pete.
fine. Thanks, Pete. Thanks, guys.
So there hasn't been a traffic study that has been done recently.
Yeah.
The state did one back when the 440-unit proposal was on the table, and that traffic study assumed that a huge percentage of the traffic would go from the hospital out to Route 27. That never made any sense to me.
Right.
It was
Me
like
neither.
70%. That was one of the big things that I remember being flawed, I thought, in that traffic study.
Right.
The only way that's going to happen is if you close Hospital Road, I think. The other thing it said was that there should be a reconfiguration of the intersections at Hospital and Harding
Yep.
to make it a T intersection, and at North and Harding to make it a T intersection to make them both safer.
There is going to be an impact. That's all. I'm trying to bring up that point. There'll be a big impact, and it
Oh, yeah.
ought to be addressed somehow, because it's to ignore it or to overlook it is a mistake, because there's going to be an impact. Thank you.
There was a minority plan to run an extra road out the back through Bill Massaro's yard. All right, what do you think, Jerry? We'll go here and then we'll go.
Okay, Jerry Potts, 7 Curve Street. So I've been in town for 27 years, and I've seen lots of volunteers who make the town go. And I, first of all, wanted to start by thanking this committee for doing just an incredible job. I attended about 3 years of the meetings, and I felt blessed that I didn't have to deal with the things that you had to deal with, and I just observed. You did a fantastic job of balancing all of the different pressures, and really it was great watching it. I'm a strong supporter of this phase of it. I don't know what the future is going to hold on what developers come with, but I'm always a believer that when you have options, then you can make decisions. Right now, the only option is to hold and watch the land deteriorate. And I think the game changer for me was when Kathy McCabe came in and said there was $40 million in historic tax credits, and I think that changed all of this, because I don't think most of the town was aware that those old buildings, there was gold in them, our buildings. So there is a question, though. On the zoning that we're going to be approving, I've heard from some people, and actually Bill Mazzaro was one of them, at Medfield Day, saying that the zoning, by approving that, we're giving basically one developer the right to bid on the disposition of the land. And I just wanted to clarify that, because that is not how I interpreted it. I thought that the zoning was basically then we go through an RFQ, RFP, and then the town would be able to look as part of that process on things like traffic and pressure on the town, because we would actually have a proposal on what the land was. So I just wanted to get a clarification on that. Is this just approving the zoning and then we go through the process and caveat emptor, we all get to vote again?
Well, I would say, the town is going to write the RFP. So, the zoning does not require a single developer and a disposition of all the parcels in one fell swoop. That's really up to the town to decide how it wants to pace
Okay.
the development.
That's what I had interpreted, and I think the zoning looks great. So great job.
Let me, I just want to, the way we're using some words, I want to make sure everybody is clear. You all are being asked to vote on zoning articles at the special town meeting. Those zoning articles enable the town to proceed with the implementation of the preferred scenario in the state hospital master plan. The RFQ, request for quotation and qualifications, sorry. You had to say that. Qualifications in the request for proposal will be finished prior to the town again being asked to approve the disposition of the land. That is very deliberate. You can't know for sure that the actual proposal will look exactly like this preferred scenario. You will know for sure what the proposal is that we want to move forward with before we're asked to have you open the gate to let the horses out of the barn. So that's clear. What I want to make sure, when Todd said the town will write the RFP, that's not we're going to have a vote by the town on the RFP. The town will write the RFP. But the place where you as taxpayers need to understand is after that's in, after a proposal's in, assuming there's a proposal that the town considers, and I would say primarily, ultimately, certainly including the Board of Selectmen, think is worth seriously looking at, that's when a disposition vote would take place. Todd, I had one question for you from the earlier question. We had at least one developer, relative to the question about the Arboretum, I believe we had at least one developer that said, listen, we're only interested in the campus. You know, we'll do the Arboretum if you want us to, but we actually, I thought if I recall, had one developer that almost would just as soon have us deal with that separately, which is at least a possibility.
I think that's basically accurate. What they said was their focus was on the historic buildings and not on, new construction or single-family homes, but they expressed that in terms of they certainly could do it, or they could bring in a partner that would handle that part of it, or if the town separated it, that was not going to prevent them from coming in to pursue the part that they were interested in.
Okay. Over on the right.
Okay. Thank you. My name is John Carey. I live at 19 Delaware Road, and I will echo Jerry's thank you to the committee for the time and work that you've put in, and a second thank you for holding this information session this evening. My question is related to the economic model. The opportunities that you've mentioned are tremendous, and obviously a lot of work's gone into it. What I haven't heard are some of the major costs that may be involved. And my understanding is the town hired a consultant 4 or 5 years ago with this project that looked at the buildings and the remediation, and they looked at other state facilities, Danvers being included, and the assessment at that time was that it was going to cost upwards of $1 million per building to remove the mold and asbestos that are contained in the buildings. So my question is, as you work with the developers, how are you factoring these costs in? If there are upwards of 30 buildings and all need to be addressed, and I don't know how many would have to be addressed, so say it's the upper end of 30 million, how is that being factored into the economic model that they're working with? And if they were to ask us to come back and say it's unfeasible for them to cover those costs, how would the town step up and potentially have to address that?
Okay, Pat Casey. So first off, I think that estimate of $1 million per building is an exaggeration.
I can get the report for you if you need it.
Okay. We do, the latest consultant we have did a building by building analysis based in part on the assessment of the building condition. So there have been estimates done that we predicted how it would look from the perspective of a builder, and it looked pretty attractive. So we assigned high odds, at the end of the master planning cycle that this would look attractive to a builder. And then the thing, I think the most important thing to know is subsequent to that, the development committee went out and got feedback from developers, and you saw, Todd's presentation. The indication is that this looks attractive to them. They may yet find, there's risks in this, they may yet find, negative surprises that, will send us all back to the drawing board with regard to the economic assessment. But, so far, it looks workable, taking advantage of the historic tax credits and the low-income housing tax credits.
I would just add, as you might imagine, this is very common for developers who work with this type of building.
Right.
And they can actually generate basis for the tax credits and raise more equity, in part by including that in their scope of work. So I think some of the things that a developer, they would probably include that as something they traditionally would pay for in something like this. I think some of the other costs that we're trying to look at, water and sewer, roads, are things that often are municipal costs. And so part of the benefit of passing the zoning is to enable the collection of better information, real information, on not just how much these things might cost, but who will pay. Right? It's kind of hard to do as a theoretical exercise, right? You really need to be talking to developers.
I understand, and my only concern, as Gus mentions, we have the liability for the property now, so the concern is what major costs may be out there, and as you better understand them, it'd be great if you can share them with the town.
Yeah,
So,
John, I just add one more thing to that too, John, and that is that, as Todd said, the remediation type costs are very highly probable to be absorbed by the developer, built into his model, in that in none of the conversations that we had did developers push back and say, I could be facing, a ton of remediation, and I would expect you, the town, as the seller, to handle that. That's just not been the case to date at all.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Here on the left? You want him to go first? Okay, you can go first.
My name is Sergey Sher. I live on the Paddock Lane, which is pretty close to Hospital Road. My question, this question, I think that was asked by one of the gentlemen before, but earlier, but I think that it was not answered in full. Because after the new 40 units on the Hospital Road, there is no traffic. I see it every day, but it will be 312 units. And I wonder, do you think that Hospital Road will need to, will need a work? I mean, now it's one lane, one way on the Hospital Road. Do you think that it will need 2 lanes, one way? And so overall 4 lanes, so 2 lanes one way and 2 lanes the opposite way, or not?
Can you?
I can't, I've been jumping up and down inside my skin for the last hour and a half here. Let me just answer this question. I'll go back to what Pete said about the 440 units and everything else. So everybody who's wondering about traffic trips, there were somewhere around the neighborhood of, I think, 26 or 2,700 trips per day for 440 units in the DCAM plan. The big concern about the road traffic, again, as Pete said, was they had everybody going down Hospital Road to Route 27, and I pointed out in my review of the plan that in all likelihood, anybody who was working towards Boston, towards Wellesley, towards whatever, we're going to be going down Hospital Road to Harding Street and then shooting up back down through Dover. So one of the concerns that the town had raised with the 440 unit plan was, it's a very strange road when you get to the corner where Harding and Hospital intersect and everything else. And also North Street is a very strange place. So one of the things that the town had suggested in their response to DCAM was that we look at some kind of a T intersection at both of those places, and that would be part of what they would impose upon the developer. Now, I may be naive, but you don't impose things on a developer without the developer looking for something in return. So there would be some kind of a quid pro quo there. With the 440 units, I was concerned that 440 units would become 450 units or 460 units, the more things that the town asked for. So hopefully that answered your question. Was I next? Oh, my goodness.
I think actually over here.
All right, good.
Over here.
My name's Jeanette Rule. I live at 23 Green Street. Since this plan started, I think climate change has become an increasing crisis, and people are ever more aware of it compared to a few years ago. And I'm wondering if this plan will be looked at through the lens of that climate change, climate crisis, and will the town have any say about that, or is it all up to developers as to how green things will be? By green, I mean not the grass and the trees, but the carbon footprint consideration.
If you'd like, I can
Go ahead, Fred. Sure.
take a stab. Fred Davis, 82 Bridge Street, and Chair of the Medfield Energy Committee. The Medfield Energy Committee has established a subcommittee to look at Medfield State Hospital development and its energy and carbon footprint. So this is an ongoing process, and we are waiting in the next couple of weeks, hopefully to hear about a grant request from the State Energy Office to give us some money to ask just these kinds of questions. And so it's an ongoing process, and I hope that the Development Committee will allow us, as we come up with the suggested language, to work with the RFQ and RFP down the road. And also, if that grant does come through, and if it doesn't, by the way, we're looking for another source of funding. But if the grant does come through, we want also to come up with an answer to a previous question: what can be done with the historic buildings to make them as energy efficient as possible? They present obviously a particular challenge, and it's a particular technical question. But we are talking with, looking to put this, if we get the grant, to go out to a couple of firms that have expertise in this area. I hope that's at least a partial answer. And I make the offer, if anybody's interested in these energy questions, to participate with the Energy Committee in the next few months.
Hi, can I jump in?
Sure,
Guess?
please do.
So, and I'd like to just address the importance of these design guidelines again in this zoning article. It's really important. So, for example, underneath the section that talks about materials and electric and gas, there's a sentence that specifically says renewable energy technologies such as solar energy, geothermal, microgrids, and waste heat recovery are encouraged. Wind turbines and standalone ground-mounted solar arrays are not encouraged. But as you can see, there's a strong evidence, and that's just one sentence. And throughout the entire design guidelines, definitely the sustainability aspects around that are important.
So let me add to that, if I may, since I've probably read every letter in the master plan. When Gil talked about some of the things that got passed down to us from the state when we bought the property, one of the things that got passed down to us, and one of the things we were encouraged to do, and there was even an incentive added to it and everything else, was to put in factors for sustainability, for green design. So those things made it into the master plan. So the master plan does address those kinds of things. The real issue here is, well, so if you don't know who I am, I'm Bill Massaro. I live on 36 Evergreen Way. I'm in a butter of the hospital and have been for 43 years now. How fast the time goes when you're having fun. January will start my 11th year of the involvement in the hospital. I fought to get the cleanup in the river. I fought didn't fight the 440-unit plan. What I kept presenting to the selectmen was the fact that the numbers that were saying it was a great deal for the town were wrong, and it wasn't a great deal for the town, and all I asked them to do was go back and to review those numbers. I was on the committee to negotiate the purchase of the hospital. I have not been on committee since, but I've been a resource. I was a resource to the Master Planning Committee. And I think I missed, in their 4 years, I think I missed 1 or 2, possibly 2 meetings with both of the consultants that they hired. So I've worked very hard to make the plan the best that it can be. And within itself, it makes a whole lot of sense. But I will tell you right now that it doesn't make a lot of sense for Medfield. And I struggled to come to this conclusion because I know how hard all of the groups worked. As I said, I sat through all of their meetings. Everybody has got a lot of time invested in this plan, and it breaks my heart that it's a horrible plan for Medfield. So I'm very sorry. So let me ask my questions. Number one.
Hey, Bill, can I just respond to that, given that that's talking about
yes,
a plan?
let me finish first.
I'd like to, given that you put that on the table, I do want to respond to this in one way. As I said, the Master Planning Committee worked for 4 years to collect inputs from the public on what they wanted to see there, and they put a plan together. The zoning issue that we're dealing with at the special town meeting is whether or not to enable proceeding. Bill may be absolutely right. It's a terrible plan, in which case we won't get any good proposals. The real issue on the table in November for you all is, after 4 years of the public telling the Master Planning Committee what it wanted, and after the Master Planning Committee doing its best to reconcile and compromise and craft a master plan or a preferred scenario that was, I can assure you, was sincerely put together to the best of their ability to reflect what you all had told them, the decision you're facing in November is, are you prepared to proceed with that or not? If the answer is no, that's fine, but my point is, it's not a vote on a specific plan that's going to be put in place. It's a question of, were you serious for those 4 years, or were you not? Some people have been against it, so some are going to say no, I get that. But the question in November is, are you serious enough about what you told the master plan for 4 years that you want to see this thing continue?
All right,
Bill's
turn,
point, down
please.
the road, there'll be another decision.
However, this is being advertised, and the selectmen and the committees are talking about you're voting on the zoning for the master plan. The zoning is for the master plan. Mm-hmm. If the master plan is flawed, why are you voting on zoning for it? Why are you voting on zoning for a flawed plan? So when it comes back from the developers who tell you, yes, we can build this plan you don't like, or yes, we can build this plan with additional units or anything else, what is the point of this two-step waste of 2 steps when you can handle it in 1 step? But I want to get back to the plan. Listen to the plan. You talked about what was important after you talked to everybody in town. What was the town most concerned about? The town was most concerned about, number 1, page 53 in the master plan, if anybody wants to write it down. Impact on schools. 60% of the people who responded wanted to know what the impact on the schools were. Read the master plan. The big flaw in the master plan is it's 29% commercial. We have 2 marketing studies that say there is no commercial space up there. You keep comparing it to DCAM and saying how much better it is than the DCAM plan. The DCAM plan had something on the neighborhood of, 20,000 square feet of commercial space. There's 91,000 feet of commercial space in this plan. The second thing people were interested on, impact on home values. Town retains control of the land. Impact on taxes. If the commercial property does not get filled with commercial use, it gets filled with units. So you keep hearing little numbers about we're going to have 293 to 334 units. That's with 91,000 square feet filled with commercial space. If it doesn't get filled with commercial space, it goes up to somewhere closer to 500 units. The very first consultant that this committee hired and fired said that nothing goes up there but 600 units. You have the risk of 460 to 500 units. You want to talk about students. DCAM had 187 students for 440 units. This plan has, starting with, I think the number was 233, and if the commercial units don't get in there, the number goes up to 281 or 300. There are serious, serious issues with this plan. You're voting on zoning for a flawed plan to get, hopefully, responses back from the developers who say, we don't want to build it? Or, what do you do if they say, we do want to build it? You have a big problem with this plan. Anybody has any questions? I'd be more than happy to answer them. People in my neighborhood have my email, wmassaro@comcast.net. You want to send me questions? I'd be more than happy to answer them. I've read every word in this article. I've read every word in the zoning plan. I can tell you I've read everything that was in the DCAM plan. I know how much money the town was supposed to make. The town was supposed to make $700,000. We're going to make $1 million in this plan after 5 years. If they fill it with commercial, the 91,000 square feet with commercial space, if they don't get 300 students. So, again, I'm not taking anything away from the committee. This committee is well-intentioned, and they've worked their butts off. I was there. I saw it. And I mean it. It breaks my heart that this is what we wound up with. So I would encourage you all to vote no for this. Thank you.
So I have a related question. I have a related question that I'll pose to my to the development committee members. So Bill's analysis presupposes that it's not on. Is the microphone on? Oh, okay. Yeah. So Bill's analysis presupposes that we have no control, right? Once the land disposition is done, that the commercial, what's zoned commercial, gets turned into housing units and so on. And my question for the experienced folks on the development committee is, when a disposition agreement is put together, do we relinquish that kind of control? Because that's the underlying supposition in what you just heard here.
So just, I can see some people waving helplessly over in the right-hand side. The question that Pat asked is, his point was that Bill's speculation on what would come out of this if things didn't work out on the commercial side presumed that the town would not be able to build in any controls in the RFP to make sure that we had some means of making sure that didn't happen. And he's referred that question over to the development committee to comment on whether, in fact, it would be feasible to put in controls to ensure that doesn't happen. With that, I'll turn it over to the committee.
Well, I would just say that there is some concern of the amount of commercial that was envisioned in the plan. However, the standpoint of developers, real-life developers that we talk to, is, if they're going to go after this project, they're going to try to make it work with what the town wants. And if it doesn't work, they're going to tell us it doesn't work, and they're going to tell us what would work. And that is the whole point of engaging the development community and getting past the zoning, because as I indicated in my remarks, you're not going to get developers who are capable of a project of this size and magnitude without a confidence level that the town wants to pursue this project. So I think there's a lot of things in real estate that are give and take. I think the master plan is a plan, like all master plans. It'll intersect with reality if we move forward, and you may not get the inn, you may not get all the commercial, but that doesn't mean you're going to have 100 more units with school-age kids. It doesn't follow that that's what the trade-off would be automatically, and in any event, the town would be voting on the disposition with those uses already laid out.
Lee, I think you're next.
Yes, thank you. Lee Treadway, 14 Kenny Road. So I have two questions. They're somewhat related. with regard to the selection of developers. And one is that what I understand is you sent out an RFI to 5, and 3 came back fairly consistent with what the plan was outlining, and 2 of them were, I guess, had some hesitation about what the plan was. So if we go ahead and approve at the special town meeting the zoning amendment, I gather the next step from early on in tonight's meeting, the next step would be sometime in the second quarter, we would issue an RFQ. And then at some point in the summer, towards the end of the summer, we would then issue an RFP. And then I get confused here. At some point after that, we'll receive obviously those responses on the RFP. And at some point we will select, I say we, the committee, I guess, will recommend a developer to be selected, or does the committee itself make that selection without any input from the town?
Lee, just from a process standpoint, at this point, the development committee was charged with doing the work they've done, which was to assess the feasibility. I think actually the selectmen will probably have, some of the specific questions you're asking are not questions that I think the development committee would know, because it hasn't been charged with anything, and actually I don't think the selectmen have figured that, have gotten that far yet. We won't worry about it probably until we know we have zoning. But if your question is, will there be a committee or some panel in place to take a look at those, to first draft the RFQ and the RFP,
right,
and then to evaluate that RFQ, or initially evaluate the RFQ, and then to evaluate the RFP, I think for sure there will be a panel looking at the RFP, and my guess is it would not just be the development committee. I would expect it would be made up of a broad cross-section of people with interest in the town.
Right, right. And then, so my other question is, where does this land disposition agreement fit into this, in the sequence of the process?
So I'm going to, if there's, Pete, you may even have a more precise, as a lawyer, have a better sense of this. The article that I expect you would have to, so correct me if I'm wrong, the article I would expect the taxpayers would vote on is a disposition article authorizing the selectmen to dispose of the land. So we have 2 things here. The land, if there's a land disposition agreement, that would be the contract with the developer. Before the town would be able to sign that contract with the developer, the taxpayers would have to empower the selectmen to actually sign that contract. So there was a little bit of confusion in the words there at the start. The taxpayers authorized the selectmen to act to dispose of the land. The selectmen would dispose of the land in accordance with what the agreement, the pending agreement would be, pending taxpayer approval, would be authorizing them to do that.
Right, and then there's a special town meeting at which the recommended developer is approved by the town?
No, it's a special town meeting where the town would approve authorizing the selectmen to dispose of the land.
Got it.
And then the selectmen would be who would actually execute the contractual agreement.
Right. And then one more question in that regard. You talked about the 5 people you sent, the 5 developers you sent the RFI out to, and 3 of them seem to be consistent with the plan, 2 of them not. Does that mean the RFQ is going to go only to those 3, or will there be other developers looked at?
Hi, Lee. Actually, more than 5 RFIs went out. We got 5 responses, and that was just the request for information. So many of the folks that were on our mailing list, and I wish I remembered how many individual, how many? Yeah, so we sent out 35 RFIs. But given the non-binding nature of it and the fact that, if they responded, fine. If they didn't, fine. We were actually pretty pleased to get 5 detailed responses back. So there was, and then the second question was, are these the only folks that would get a request for qualifications?
Right.
And the answer to that would be no. That would be, broadly advertised to the, through any medium that would attract,
Right.
Developers of that scope.
Okay, thank you.
Go to the left.
Patrick Conley, 4 Woodfall Road. A few things. Do we know what it costs right now to maintain the property per year?
You have the exact numbers. Okay. So I think the question came up at the Board of Selectmen's meeting. The maintenance cost, oh, there's Christine. Well, see if I get it right, because I think Christine answers about $150,000 a year is what we've been running at. So the cost to the town right now, $310,000 to pay off annually for 10 years the $3.1 million debt. So that's going out right now, and we're halfway. We bought it in 2014, so we're about at the halfway mark. $150,000 or so to pay for the maintenance of the property, which for 2 years, and I think maybe going on for a third year, the taxpayers will not be charged, because what we've been doing is also generating revenue from the property, the most significant of which was the movie that got filmed up there. So that was going into a revolving fund, and that revenue has been used for the last 2 years to pay the maintenance costs. And based on Christine's last projection, she thinks we'll be able to also avoid an article for this coming fiscal year based on what the balance is in the revolving fund. On top of that, in the past, what's happened is we've also funded the activities of the State Hospital Master Planning Committee. So it's varied from year to year. Some years it's been $100,000, some years it's been $150,000. So when we had a committee trying to put this master plan together for 4 years, we also were putting in somewhere between $100,000 and $150,000 into that. That's not a recurring cost in that category, but if we move ahead with the development, we will have some cost that we'll have to look at to hire probably a project manager and perhaps a part-time lawyer to handle the legal side of this. So this is not a costless decision if we move ahead with the project.
One other thing.
How am I doing, Christine? That all right? Good. All right.
Okay.
Good.
Well, so we must have an income of several $100,000 then.
Yes.
Okay. Between that and
Yep.
movies, auto show, and whatever else.
Yep.
One other thing. I know it was mentioned at some prior meetings about water. Is there enough water that we can pull out of the land to even support several hundred units of housing? I don't know where that landed. Do we know if we have enough water, or do we have to build more wells, drill more wells, put more into that? What's the story there?
Yeah, Randy Kargh. I also sit on the Board of Water and Sewerage, and we're looking at that. The recent engineering study for the water use at that site is about 114,000 gallons a day. The simple answer on the water side is I think we've got adequate water supply. We may have to look at water use patterns. Our water withdrawal is regulated by the state at 1.5 million gallons a day, and we're well below that for most of the year, but when we have heavy lawn watering in the summertime, we do have a bit of a capacity crunch, but we'll be looking at that pretty closely.
I just want to, so, John Thompson and I have worked very closely on the cleanup at the hospital, and unfortunately, I learned about some of his other costs, kind of, by osmosis. But he's currently running somewhere in the neighborhood of about $80,000 to cut all of the grass up there. And he's been spending about another $20,000 keeping the buildings from deteriorating. And he's been going at it piecemeal, and probably for another $100,000 a year, he could probably zip them up so they'd last forever. But right now it's about $80,000 a year. And so what Christine said about being good for 2 years with $165,000 is probably very close, I think, to what's actually going on.
So that would suggest actually a lower annual than what I just gave you of 150.
We're running about 150,000.
Yeah, but I'm saying as we chip away at, that's not a bad word to talk about the buildings and say chip away, but as we chip away at the things that are wrong with them, I mean, the number comes down. It doesn't come down as fast as it would be if we made a slightly larger investment. But
we have some other assorted, like liability insurance costs, so it's not purely cutting grass and repairing the buildings. Over here.
Thanks for all the work. Matt Perillo, 44 Evergreen Way. I had trouble following the descriptions of the map. One, I wasn't following the water tower description. if you wouldn't mind going over that again. It sounded like there was going to be parking or something, and on the map, I see two little light-colored, what look like buildings in that water tower section. Two, I don't know what mixed use means, I apologize, but if you could explain what mixed use is. And three, could you show where the group home goes? Because on this map that I received, there's no group home kind of icon. So that's what I'm kind of curious about. So water tower.
So,
Water tower here,
so
group home.
just let me apologize. We were working independently on all of these graphics, and at the last minute, we realized today that that version wasn't as accurate as the one that was projected.
Sure.
So that's why the group home icon isn't there.
Yeah.
But it's up in the, if you look on the, right by the water tower.
Got it.
Okay, and remember, this is a conceptual design. This is not something that's going to, you could give to somebody to build. So our idea was we could have a group home. We think that's the best place for it. The developers will probably have a different point of view on that. You also asked about the water tower. Basically, the water tower can't be used for anything other than a parking lot or a community garden.
Okay, so those two light things.
And there are some restrictions, yeah, and again, that was conceptual. There are some actual restrictions on how much construction you can have around a water tower by regulation.
Yeah.
We didn't deal with that. When you get a detailed construction package, that's when you look at those kind of regulations and you make sure everything is done according to specifications, engineering standards. So, our view is that's not usable space for activities other than just a parking lot and maybe a garden.
And then mixed use, what does that mean?
It means it's a variety of uses, although I'm not sure I have the right legal term for it, but my understanding is that you have multiple uses within a zone. Commercial, residential.
The other question I had was, I want to confirm that these articles that we're going to vote on don't make any changes to traffic flow. Like, the questions have been raised about impact on traffic, but we're not voting on anything which says there's now a new entrance into this area, or is that
No,
true?
again, that would be another element that would be part of the land disposition agreement and negotiations with the preferred development partner. And by way of reference, my understanding is traffic considerations is a part of any of the detailed plans going forward. Our first consultant had taken a look at the traffic patterns as part of their deliberations. We didn't spend as much time with Kathy McCabe on it, but it was always understood that traffic studies will be an important part of the final plan that gets approved. And again, you've got all of the governing bodies of the town that will be looking at this and approval. So, I feel pretty comfortable there are ways of managing this so that our expectations are met.
Thank you. And the last question I have is just, are we talking about one developer, or is this multiple developers? Does this process
Let me answer.
contemplate- I'm just confused.
We
We
spent
talk
a
about
lot of
partner.
time on the committee, and in my humble opinion, wasted time arguing about how a developer should execute this project. They do projects. We're a bunch of volunteers who think we know something about something we don't know anything about, actually. Yeah, well, Pat's smarter than me. But we need to focus on what we want to have up there.
Yeah.
And let the developers tell us how we might realize that, because that's the business they're in.
Okay.
We argued a lot about costs. We don't know. We've never built anything like this. Developers build these things all the time. We need to get it out on the street, let the developers look at that, tell us, there are parts of this, as Bill said, very aspirational parts on the amount of commercial space. That may or may not be viable, but developers know this space a lot better than we do, and they'll tell us if we're right or we're wrong. But the only way to find out is to get it out on the street so you can have an earnest conversation. As Todd said, they can spend $1 million putting together a proposal, and that's a lot of detail work and a lot of investment and a lot of knowledge. And the only way we can tap into that knowledge is to get out on the street and talk to these folks.
I will add on to what Randy just said with regard to single versus multiple or whatever. That can be a choice, by the town, But I believe that when our requests for qualifications or requests for proposal go out, there'll be certain developers who'll say, well, I don't know anything about apartments or condominiums, but I am a senior housing developer, and I'd like to bid on a portion or that portion or whatever. So whether it's by design or by accident, it's likely that you'll have more than one developer involved.
That's what I was asking.
And
Thanks.
so.
Thank you.
Laurel Scotty, 10 Green Street. With regard to the commercial space, who is responsible for soliciting the businesses that will go in there? Is it the developer or is it the town? And then who is the landlord for the business that would be in the commercial space?
Developer. The developer.
The developer's, and the developer would be the landlord.
Correct.
So following up on the comment that it could go residential, if this is billed as commercial property, can it be converted, can it be changed to residential without it going to the town for a change in zoning laws? Or, I mean, we have different codes now in town, which is business industrial. So if that's to be commercial property, must it be maintained as commercial property?
The use of the word commercial that is included in the plan is essentially, it's not industrial, it's not manufacturing, it's essentially expected to be what I would call like service commercial, things that would be appropriate and consistent with a neighborhood that would need certain things, whether it be, the coffee shop or something of that nature.
That's what I expected.
And that's all, and that is in the zoning ordinance. So this new zoning won't allow, a freight truck yard and manufacturing and the like.
Oh, no, that's not my concern. My concern is that if the coffee shop or the donut shop or the grocery store did not go in, since it's being considered business or commercial property, may it be changed by the developer to residential without the town changing the status of that piece of the property?
Well, through the permitting process, the town is going to control what the developer builds consistent with the contract that we signed with them.
Okay.
So, there's another thing too, and I think Jean's here somewhere. In the context of the word like commercial and everyone's saying, well, commercial's not going to work. It depends on the kind. For example, a number of the so-called commercial uses would be the marketing and sale of the artistic goods that the artists would be creating in their live workspace. So it's yet to be proven that the percentages of commercial versus habitational, it'll all be part of the economic model that's going to work. But it's included in the zoning so that the flexibility can exist and be beneficial to both the town and the developer partner.
I think they should put in a wine and cheese shop, and that'll be very successful.
One other comment, although it's a hard one to follow, is in some of the conversations with developers, I think their reservations about the commercial and the amount of it there's a relationship to commercial rent, and the more commercial you have, and maybe you don't want to take things away from downtown Medfield, where that gets manifested, I think, in their minds is the rent they're collecting on that space. So I think your question's a very good one, and we should get an answer to that question, but I don't think from interviews with developers they're thinking there's going to be a bait and switch around the commercial and they can do more units. I think they understand the town wants 300 units and not much more than that.
Could I try answering your question a different way? And again, the panel can correct me if I'm wrong, but part of your question I would have thought, maybe, and Teresa's probably the one to keep me on track here. If you look at the table of uses for each of the areas, like when you asked that question, I didn't know if you were talking about the west slope, which is zone commercial, so you have to kind of look in the area to see what the allowed uses are, that even know if your question is pertinent to the, whether it applies or not is going to partly depend on the uses that are called out for the different areas. Thanks.
Megan Sullivan from 36 Wichita Road. So I have a couple questions. One is, I heard Fred Davis ask or say that he was going to do this grant work and ask if you would include it in your RFP, but I didn't hear you say you would. Yes? Okay, thank you. And then, second of all,
Can I comment on that?
Yeah.
Not as this panel, but as one selectman. The answer that he got to the question was that there was a lot of things that encourage things. I think that's very easy. Something that mandates something, I can say at least personally, I will look hard at if that adds cost to what may already be a difficult cost project. So my whole bias on that side has been not to do things to throw rocks into a boat that might be riding low in the water. So encouragement is great. I can say that Kathy McCabe, something that didn't come up here, one of the things that she's been advocating for is a heat recovery system in the septic, which I don't know enough about it, but basically apparently there are projects that if you do them, you're eligible for grants. So anything that either is a good idea that we want to encourage because it's just flat out a good idea, encouragement's fine. Anything that makes financial sense on its merits for a developer, I think I would be inclined to say that's great. Something that adds cost to the project because a long-term analysis, I'm worried about where this boat's riding in the water. So,
thank you. I just wanted to be sure his work was going to be
Yeah.
at least thought about and included in
Yep.
what you hope to ask for from people. So we've got the map, but what I would love to see is a map that said like West Slope, we want it to be this zoning, because I'm a little confused about how we choose the zoning based on this, yet I've heard you say the developer may come back and say, you know, I'd really rather put the senior housing over here and the, what was the one? The group home maybe belongs someplace else. So are we putting certain zonings in each of these areas? Or is there some flexibility?
Correct. There is certain zoning in each one of those subzones.
Okay.
And that's outlined in the zoning document. And there are two really key tables. I mean, read the whole thing, but there's a table 1, which is the permitted use. And it has all the, like a typical zoning document, the different use types and whether it's a yes, no, special permit or planning board. And so that's on pages 9 through 11. And then also in the design guidelines, a key table to focus on is also table 3, which is also describes the subzones. So we talk about the, you know, okay, what if they want to do something else? And you'll find this very true through the core campus descriptions. You'll see that in the footprint of the core campus, to kind of reinforce the historic preservation and the reuse of the buildings, it says it's limited to existing building footprints in the design guidelines. And so you'll see that throughout that.
If there would be some way for you to put it in a map rather than a chart, the way you've done it with the colors, you know what I mean? So we know.
It's a little hard to put a 37-page document on one slide. That's why we didn't try and do that here. If we'd put that level of detail, you couldn't possibly read it. So you really do have to read 37 pages to understand. About half of it is design guidelines and the permitted uses that tell you what you can build, and the other half is the process for management and control. So it's a bit of a what you can do as well as how it gets done kind of a document. But there's no way to escape reading through it to understand all of the thought that's been put into this master plan. And again, it's a conceptual plan. That's why there are multiple permitted uses in certain of these areas, so there's some flexibility for the developers to come back and say, here's a design that meets your intent. It's a little bit different than what you envisioned, but we think it will work better. One of the best advice we got early on from the folks that worked at Foxborough was be very focused on what your objectives are and be flexible in the actual design, because more than likely developers will have a little different way of achieving the same objectives that you'd like.
Is the zoning document posted? The proposed one? Yes,
Yeah.
it is.
Yeah, just, if you want to see the plan, I mean, it's online, but there's also copies of the plan at the library and at the town hall. So if you want to understand the plan, particularly at this level, you need to really look at some of the charts in that to see what the permitted uses are. And that way you can get a specific answer to that.
Right, so I could take the west slope and say it's not going to be single-family cottages, it's not going to be 2 and 3 family, it's not going to be, and, okay. So, but it could be a multifamily dwelling. But, okay.
Yeah.
And then would, I think it kind of went to the last question, but in terms of the developer, a single developer or multiple developers, it would be nice, I'm sure you'll ask for it, just to see like their break-even points, right? So we don't give away those nice condos in the top left corner and then they're done, you know what I mean? Where will they stop and how can we phase that in so that we're sure it gets all the way to the end? Thank you for your work.
Let me just comment on that too. I mean, the zoning is neutral about that. It's not specifying if it's a single developer or multiple developers. If you look at other projects, you know, if you look at Foxborough, for example, it's a good example. That was done by, I think, three major developers, you know, that concentrated on different aspects to it because they had different expertise. I've walked around with developers and they'll say, for example, they'd be interested in one section, say the east section, which would be, you know, a CCRC, a retirement home, and maybe a memory center, disability center, that type of thing. So when you talk to developers, they'll often have a specific expertise, you know, which they would concentrate on. It's possible that a single developer could do everything. I'm sure there are out there. But at least the experience I've had by talking and looking at other places, it's often multiple developers. But it's important that you're asking good questions, but a lot of these questions are not the zoning plan. You know, it's not there. The zoning is neutral on that type of thing.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. And I would like to reiterate that this, as Gus mentioned early on, that when you read this, what has been posted, it is including Southfield and Sledding Hill. Those sections will be extracted for the actual special town meeting. So don't get, you know, don't concentrate on South, concentrate on the core campus that we've talked about tonight. Also, October 21st is our second, at the planning board, second public hearing on the zoning, and the last.
Thanks, Megan.
Thank you.
Chris, didn't see you there to start with. You actually should have gotten
Just
that.
listening, being patient. Chris Potts, 7 Curve Street. Again, just extend the thanks to everyone who's been so involved with this over the years. And also, just an observation, whether it's the selectmen's meetings or something like this, I personally love hearing differences of opinion and people disagreeing with each other, because I think that's what makes a really strong democracy, is for people to have the courage and speak up about what they feel and what they think. I am looking just for some really fundamental clarification on numbers. So it was mentioned at the beginning of tonight that the expected total units was somewhere between 312 and 355. Do we actually have an estimated number of school children as part of that number? I've been hearing numbers, different numbers been floating around.
You can hear me? Yeah. So the number, last week went through the financials with the warrant committee, you know, as the projected financials, right? We all have to wait until we see a real proposal, right, before we know what we're really up against. But the working midpoint number for school children on what we call the high case, you know, with the more units, was 207, if I recall correctly. And, you know, we did our analysis with a range of all the important variables. We did an analysis with the range of those things. And I'll just point out that looking at the nightmare case and what I call the jelly side up case, where everything goes right versus everything goes wrong, town came out positive in terms of the aggregate impact, over the course of the 20 years of the project.
Okay, great.
So,
Okay. I'm just trying to factor that in with the 800 student projection for the Dale Street School project, and the comment being made that that doesn't include Medfield State Hospital. So that number is floating around out there, like what is that number for Medfield State Hospital, in addition to the 800 projected for the Dale Street project. So that's what I'm looking for. Thank you.
Tim Knight from 34 Oriole, and I'm also a member of the school committee. A follow-up, I was going to ask the question Christine just asked, but what's the assumptions in terms of senior housing versus non-senior housing? And if it's in the report, I'm sorry, I have not read it.
It is in the master plan somewhere, right? I recall the table.
It is.
So the number exists, it's just.
Okay, and even, I'd be curious just to see, but does the zoning process allow for like either a not to exceed or a cap on the number of units that could be in place? And maybe a follow-up to there, if could it? That might make people more comfortable, to say it will not be greater than X. So is that something you've considered, or is it feasible?
I don't think a specific cap on the number of units is feasible when you're going out at this point in the process. But the number of senior units we felt were approximately 23 to 25 senior appropriate single-family and duplex units. There were also historic rehab apartments targeting somewhere around 180, and then 22 to 40 market rate condos. These are projected targets. You can never say that this is an exact figure at this point. So there are units that, by their design guidelines, would be specific to seniors or people who are downsizing.
That total came in?
Well, the total that would be specific to seniors would be 23 to 25, and then that doesn't preclude them from living in the historic rehab apartments or other places on campus.
And just as far as, you said a cap isn't feasible, I'm not trying to be challenging at all, I'm more just seeking to understand it. Is it just because you think you would reduce support from developers or reduce support from the town, or what are the...
Can I clarify your question? Your question was actually, could there be a cap in the zoning article that would put that control? So actually, Teresa's probably the one who should answer whether or not zoning articles can be written to cap the total number of housing units as opposed to the density of a housing unit. I've only seen zoning that affects density, not some number.
Yeah, I'd have to go to council on that.
Okay. But no, your specific question was, can we cap the number in a zoning article? And I don't think that's the place you would cap it. You might cap it in an RFP for a project, but not in a zoning article,
Correct,
I don't think.
right. That's where I guess I was heading without clarifying it. This would not be a time when we would specify a cap, not in the zoning language.
But if your broader concern is regarding control, it was mentioned earlier that we can exercise long-term control through, there is the zoning, which, specifies uses in certain areas, but then we can also control the number of units through permitting and so on. So it's not like the town relinquishes control of the number of units upon disposition of the property.
Okay, thank you.
Tracy Hogan, 20 Hospital Road. You had mentioned that after this goes through, you're going to focus on the traffic patterns. And I was wondering, what is the plan? Are you going to be hiring experts? Because making a T out of Harding and Hospital and North is not going to solve the traffic problem. Also, there is no sidewalk currently that even goes into town from that end of town. The sidewalk ends at Hospital Road and Harding. So what is the plan to configure the roads for this kind of development?
During that RFP, the developer would actually be engaging and help doing the traffic study that would be required for that actual proposal that would be coming to the town. So I can't say now, none of us could say now what that would look like.
Well, I have a bone of contention to having the developer do the traffic study, because we had that situation happen on Hospital Road with the development, the Chapel Hill. You had mentioned the Chapel Hill traffic study. Developers tend to do traffic studies when there's not a lot of traffic. That particular traffic study was done the day after Thanksgiving. So there was no traffic from the fields. When there's a lot of traffic that's used at the fields. Also, we get a lot of traffic from Dover-Sherburne High School. The day after Thanksgiving, there's no traffic on that road. So leaving it up to the developer to run the traffic study, there's a conflict of interest there, I think, because that's not in the town's best interest to leave it up to the developer to do the traffic study.
Right, so I think, have this all the time with the Affordable Housing Trust, for example. The town expects the developer to produce a traffic study that's reviewed by the town, and then there can be other concerns and questions that come out of that. For example, the American Legion project, I know, has led to some discussions about redoing that intersection, and it's not necessarily the case that the developer would do it, the town may be deciding to do it. So I think everyone agrees it's a valid question. It's hard in the abstract without knowing which part of the project goes first, et cetera. But I think our expectation would be you'd have all kinds of studies, including traffic, as part of any proposed development.
But I think the traffic study needs to be on the side of the residents and not really on the side of the developer, because the developer will skew the traffic study to their advantage. I mean, that's what's happened previously. And also the town is going to have to make a commitment to put infrastructure in at such as sidewalks. I mean, you can't expect a developer to put a sidewalk in going into town from a development in Hospital Road. That's really a commitment that the town would have to make. Has that been included in any of this?
I think there's two things. One, I think you actually can require a developer to put in a sidewalk as part of a project if the finances are there to support that. However, the highway department does have a plan for putting sidewalks in. It's just that there's a rate that you can put them in. So they have looked at going up there. I think this past year they were looking at whether to do it up the Dale Street route from off of West Mill, or whether to do it up Harding Street. And I think they chose the Dale Street route on the theory that there was more. But the town, we all understand there's a sidewalk issue. In fact, there's a sidewalk issue coming out of the center of town getting up to the public safety building. The issue is how much the town can afford to spend putting sidewalks in any given year. So there is a plan, and actually part of the townwide master plan has also been asked to come in with a more coherent approach for how we're going to address sidewalk needs. I think ideally we'd like to be able to have sidewalks all the way up to the state hospital, but it's going to take a while to get there, undoubtedly.
I don't have a microphone, but I'll add one other comment. And there is such a thing as on-site and off-site mitigation. And if there are near proximate concerns about the development, it's totally within the right in the permitting process, and as long as it's provided for in the zoning, to insist that a developer put in certain infrastructure or certain mitigating things. There's also off-site mitigation. I'll give you a great example. When we studied the Danvers State Hospital, there was a concern about busing any school-aged children from the Danvers State Hospital to the Danvers schools, and the town didn't want to pay for the busing. They forced Avalon Bay to pay for the busing as part of the land use agreement. So there are creative ways to deal with the municipal impacts. And you don't win them all, but through conversations like this, you get the concerns of the people out there, and you make them part of the contractual negotiation.
Well, I would just hope that you would hire a consultant that would work for the town to mitigate maybe some of these road issues, because right now there's going to be one road that is going to be impacted with this, and it's Hospital Road.
Yeah,
And that's going to go on to Harding, and then we have that very dangerous curve on Harding after you leave Hospital Road. So I think really the town needs to hire a consultant to act in the interest of the town to figure out the best traffic pattern for this development.
There's another old adage in development too, as it relates to dealing with developers, and it kind of goes like this: he who broke it fixes it. So, I mean, I did a development in the town of Wareham where there was an intersection that was strained and strained and strained. Finally, we asked to pull a permit to do one thing, and they said, you broke it, now you fix it, which we had to do. So sometimes these are opportunities to deal with longstanding concerns, not just the ones that are imminently created by result of the development, but have been lingering. You've been trying to find, someone to cover it. So.
Gus, could I impose upon you to put up that diagram that shows the west side, east side? And
The map?
picture? Yeah, the map, that'd be great.
Got to make sure I'm going in the right, no, that's the wrong way. See, I knew I'd screw that up. Okay, Sarah.
Blue screen. Well, while you're bringing it up, I just want to make an observation.
Right there.
Again, Paul Mason from Long Meadow Road, been a resident for 20 years.
Where? Okay, do it.
Here we go.
Oh, yeah, but.
Great.
I want the full screen.
Yeah.
No, that's the slideshow.
Okay.
I had
So-
a 50-50 chance of doing that right. Screwed
Thanks.
up.
So the observation is I've been sitting here and I've walked this land for 20 years. We bought the property because we didn't want the state to take control of it. We wanted to be able to take control of our own property. Okay, that's great. Then we had, we went out for an appeal for everybody to give their ideas on how to use this property, which was great. And so all this inertia has gone into us, and wonderful work by all these committees over many, many years. But the basic flaw to me, quite frankly, as I sit here and look at this, that original land with those original buildings, with that original amount of population, those people didn't move. They were state hospital patients. The traffic coming in and out of this area was minimal. And now we're going to go and use it for a completely different use and put it all on one little peg here. It's like we're putting this huge weight on a very small, and I think we've lost sight of that. I really do. I think we've forgotten about how this property was originally used, and the infrastructure was there to support that use. And now we are going hundreds of times past what originally it was used for. And I think that's a major flaw here. The infrastructure just won't support that volume, that weight that this property is going to impose on that one road. That's my observation. Thank you. Thanks for all the hard work.
Just to the quick response from my part, the one thing I would ask you to consider on that, we've talked about how many housing units they are. Some of those housing units are a CCRC. Others of those housing units are live workspace. The Arboretum, I think, based on the concept, which may or may not be what turns out, is senior housing. So, yeah, they're housing units, but they're not necessarily commuter people working in Boston with 2 cars. So I'm not trying to trivialize it. I'm just saying I don't think it's a straight line.
I guess my observation would be, I don't know that us using this property requires us to use it this extensively. That there are other options for this property without putting so much on it.
Like what?
That's my observation.
Like what?
Well, no, the
Well, you
point
said
is,
that-
it doesn't have to be this volume of, this is a huge weight that we're gonna put on that one road, honestly.
Okay, all right. John?
John Harney, 17 Maplewood Road. First of all, I'd like to thank Mr. Massaro for his presentation, his addressing the committees tonight. He says just about exactly what I would have said. I wonder, though, why the two selectmen who particularly pushed having this November 18th meeting chose to do so at that time. I mean, there's so much we don't know. We don't know what the impact of the housing that we've worked so hard to obtain to forestall 40B, and we're told that should be in safe harbor, all things going well, until 2030. Why at this time are we pressing to do what the gentleman just said, overburden this piece of land up there? As far as the money that we hear, we're wasting money up there. Every year, we hold that property as it is, with repairs when they need to be made, is making the town a lot of money. First of all, we're not incurring the expenses we would be incurring were it developed. Secondly, it's a magnificent piece of land, which everyone extols, and then we turn around and meet the enemy. It's ourselves trying to develop that property. The state has 105 acres up there. I wonder if the state's going to be terribly happy about heavy development there when they finally found out what the town may do for it. So this is remarkably ill-timed. We don't have the data that we need from water and sewer, among others. We don't have the school data. Jeff Marsden's talking about putting modulars in at Memorial School to care for the growth of students in the early years. You can't go through town and not realize that these houses that are turning over are bringing in a very young population. So the people of Medfield should vote this down and vote it down solidly. Thank you.
Jeff
Here on the
Hyman,
left.
Jeff Hyman, Metacomet Street. I moved to Medfield with my wife in 1992. Certainly seen a lot of changes. I participated in 2 or 3 of the committee meetings, and you guys did a really good job. I mean, the original committee, and being able to participate was impactful. But it doesn't mean that you can change your thoughts. But I just had a question. You've all put a lot of time and effort, and I wanted to ask this committee 2 questions. What do you love about this? What are you in this for? What's driving you to be passionate about this? And what's in it for the rest of us? So I'm a resident. If I'm thinking the grandeur, I'm living on the water view, overlooking the Charles River, and enjoying that in my twilight years. But I guess my question is, what do you love about this, each of you, and what's in it for the rest of the town? I mean, I'm hearing about the traffic, and that is the most serious thing, because we all deal with it, right? Aside from town employees, most of us do not live and work in Medfield. We drive distance, and we are cutting through Westwood, Dover, and the rest. So I went for one of the plans, and I looked at something very similar to this: open space, agriculture, and then recreational and residential. And I'm certainly open to that, but I am hearing more concerns about the traffic, the schools certainly for people that are concerned about that. But what's in it for you? What do you love about this, and what's in it for the rest of the people that are residents of the town?
All righty, hi, thank you. I will start. So what do I love about it? I love that we're able to preserve the buildings. Every year that you leave those buildings up there without doing anything to them means they are further and further deteriorating, and we're spending more and more to try to keep them up. At this point, remediation is a lesser cost than if a building falls in. If a building falls in, you have a greater cost because the materials are mixed. So I think rather than wait and try to piecemeal the preservation of the buildings, that we plan on doing something about it. What I love is that the cottage plan, that the layout of the buildings will essentially remain. The design guidelines, if a building is taken down, will allow for the footprint to be reused for a building, but not further expansion. So it preserves your view sheds. You'll still have those great views, the vistas that we've become accustomed to. You know, the running joke is that we bought a $3.1 million dog park. And I don't have a dog. So I would truly like to see the preservation of the views, the buildings. I love the architecture up there. I really think they're worth saving. And what's in it for the rest of us? I mean, maybe, you know, down the road, we'll all be living in the great building up back and have a great view of the Charles. Maybe it'll be that we're in the CCRC. Who knows? You know, we don't know. I'm just hoping, you know, for future generations that there'll be something up there to appreciate. I understand the traffic concerns. We addressed it and looked at it in our uses, trying to come up with communities also that were underserved. You know, a gentleman asked about senior housing, and truthfully, we don't address that properly in town. We don't address millennial housing. My kids can't move back here. You know, there are certain populations that don't have a place to go, and we can do something about that and preserve a piece of our history. So that's my viewpoint.
Okay. Now, I'd like to react a little bit to the way you framed the question. You know, what's in it for you and what's in it for the rest of us? And we're the...
I didn't mean what's in it for you, like you have an interest in this, like monetarily. It's you're doing this.
Yeah.
You're passionate. You
Right.
all have backgrounds and jobs, and so what excites you about this? What
Right.
is it that, like, I love this?
Yeah, but I would just say that our interests, I would say, are no different than any other citizen in the town. We're just a subset of the rest of the town, so I don't know that we bring a different perspective to it than like you would if you happen to be on the committee, right? That's the you know, the main point there. And then I guess the two things. So I'm the financial geek on the committee here, right? So to my mind, the two things that this brings is, one is people can continue, not exactly, but to a fair degree, to continue to have the same experience up there as they've had before. Of course, the buildings will be occupied. My joke is they'll be occupied with people, not ghosts, but you'll have, you know, similar look and layout, and can continue to go there, and it'll still feel welcoming to you. So that's the qualitative aspect of it. And then I'm acutely aware that we have like on the order of a $25 million overhang of remediation or demolition costs, you know, if we elect to do nothing with it and have zero impact. Indeed, that is not an unattractive thought, that we just have a big park up there. The bad news is then if we elected to do that, we'd be explaining to you how we have to raise a whole bunch of money to achieve that. So this plan comes close to, you know, we get very similar aesthetics, very similar experience, and we don't negatively impact the taxpayers. That's how it looks to me.
I'll add one thing. Brandy and Pat just made great statements, but what I love most about this plan was the amount of community outreach that was involved, the number of meetings that we've had, the number of, people who are interested and are on the newsletter list and following us on social media. That I really feel after sitting through these meetings for 4 years, the Medfield State Hospital Master Planning Committee meetings, that every single person on the committee truly cared about doing the very best thing for Medfield. And I was so proud to be a part of it.
What I am passionate about is that that property is one of the most valuable, pristine properties in the town. And what happens up there can have a huge beneficial impact on Medfield. And what I like about it is that it has a mixture of housing, culture, ties in with agriculture. It's a very rich plan versus things that we've seen where a developer has taken a property like that and put in a lot of housing in it. And the other thing that I think is so important about where we are right now is that we have a good plan. There's always modifications. It always can get better. We have a zoning plan that's very general in many ways. And what it's doing, the zoning plan, I think, as Gus said initially, it's getting it out into the real marketplace. That is to say, the developer marketplace, and getting real feedback on if it's feasible or not. As Randy said, we're not experts in this, so we would taking the step to actually get it out into the marketplace. Ensure it's going to be changed. It has a great deal of flexibility in it, so it's not casting anything in concrete. It's simply taking that step to get it down, get it out. And I think a bad mistake would be to simply kick the can down the road. That is to say, not do anything, not get it out and take the next step, and just sort of push it down someplace to an indefinite future. I think what that would do is set it back, set the whole thing back. And that's why I think it's important that we take that step now.
Theresa, go ahead.
I think we need to keep in mind that this site is very beautiful, but it's very expensive to do anything up there. And very early on, Pat characterized our challenge as a highly constrained optimization project. And I think we did a pretty good job of getting input and incorporating a plan that approximately works financially for the town and for the developers, and that's tough to do at this site because it is a beautiful place, but it's also very expensive. And we don't have a lot of alternative uses that make sense. I think Brandy made the comment, or Pat made the comment. Right now, if you tear down one of these buildings and do a demolition that's thoughtful, that is, you go in and you take out all the hazardous materials and then knock down the building, it's expensive. But if you allow that building to fall in on itself and commingle hazardous materials with non-hazardous materials by legislation, that entire pile of rubble must be disposed of in a licensed hazardous material landfill. The closest one we know of used to be in Maine, but now it's Ohio. So your demolition expense, if you allow these buildings, if we kick the can down the road because we want to go back and study it, hoping that by some thunderbolt, some miraculous new development, new idea or change happens, you can put another committee in place and they can study this for 4 more years, and you're going to come back with the same inputs and probably a plan that doesn't look materially different than what we have.
And will be more expensive.
It will be more, and along the way, you're gonna spend money stabilizing those buildings so they don't fall in on themselves, because if that happens, we are not gonna be happy with the disposal bill for one of those buildings if it happens to fall in. So there's some real risk. There's risk there now just with the slate tiles falling off the roofs. There are no paths that I see that are not fraught with risk. And the best use of this is, in my opinion, is let's take this out, like Gil says, now and see what the market tells us. I visited the Traverse City, Michigan hospital, and they wasted 10 years on false starts. It's been 20 years of development up there now. And for the first 10 years, it was one blind alley, dead end, false start after another. So, you know, if you want to be paralyzed by analysis, you know, go ahead, but I don't think that's the right thing for the town to do.
Theresa.
And for me, it really is one word. It's the opportunity for Medfield. Opportunity. This preferred option, the planning we've done, all the examination, why we're even looking at this, it's about opportunities for Medfield, to explore the opportunities for Medfield. It's not even to say that it is exactly this. In this preferred option, the thing that appeals to me most out of this preferred option is this balance we've achieved in public access to this space and the use of that space still, with the open space of the green still inviting to you, for the potential of public programming that can be done from the extension of the arts and culture, to also the opportunity to address housing stock options that we don't have available in town. And where else are we going to put a CCRC and address some of the senior housing and those types of housing, assisted living up there, along with the group homes and things of that nature. I mean, housing and residential is an opportunity for us to diversify our housing stock. So for me, it's kind of this balance of all of that, bringing opportunities to Medfield through this effort.
Hi, I'm Johnny Martinez. I think I'm the only one that hasn't spoken up here. I'm on the development committee. I don't know if I will give too much of an impassionate speech, because I think we were tasked with not writing the master plan or not rewriting the master plan, but being kind of a technical tool for the town to analyze and do whatever work is needed to be done from this point forward. I will echo Randy, though, in his words on kicking the can down the road. I do think it's a little foolish to go to, the town voted to buy a piece of property. The town gave the resources to put a planning board together. They spent 4 years going to the town for the information, and the town is again going to get to vote on zoning, and the town is again, it's not like the town has not wanted this. And I'm sure there are people that don't, but you know, you just have to ask yourself that question. Are we just running our heads into a wall over and over and over? We can do a committee every 4 years, like you said. You know, it's kind of just time to, you know, put our work boots on and get to work. And maybe that means that, you know, the town's going to vote it down. All this work has been for nothing, and you're not going to get a good proposal. And then it is what it is. But then, you know, you just got to be prepared that in the coming years, it's going to be, hey, we need $800,000 for a roof. We need this for that, and people are going to say, well, what are we ultimately doing up there? I don't know. We're just going to be putting roofs up for the next 30 years, 40 years, or maybe then after we've spent all that money, we'll just scrape it all for $25 million and then just have a park, you know. So I think you just have to ask yourself those questions.
I feel like I can answer your question in a couple of different ways. I moved to Medfield in 1995. I remember when the hospital was open. I remember when it closed. I remember what it was like to actually be on the site for the first time when a lot of those buildings came down and it was really opened up so those of us in town could take advantage of it for recreational purposes. But, you know, I'm also in this because I'm a taxpayer, right? And we bought this thing in 2014, and I want something for my money, right? We've spent that money, we've spent hundreds of thousands of dollars beyond that investing in what's up there right now. And, you know, my kids are now college age, but part of me, the first kid that falls off the roof, everybody in town is going to be saying, why did the town of Medfield buy this hospital in 2014 and not do anything about securing this property? We bought it because we didn't want DCAM to RFP it out to some developer and get 500 units. We have people responding to the RFI that are interested in doing it. They want to pursue it collaboratively with the town. We also have people saying they're interested in scraping the site and doing 500 plus units, or in another example, 700 units like they did on 37 acres, not 128 acres out in Westboro. So I think realistically, there's an opportunity to do a project here. Is it the best possible project? Who knows? We're never going to know, you know, sitting here talking about it and not engaging the real world and what the town can get out of this.
Can I just add one other thing? With the unit count, the master plan specifies a unit count that came from the town's input of what would be somewhat, you know, financially viable, as well as, you know, nobody wants a ton of units. That's why we bought it in the first place. Developers know that. They know that they're going to have to come to these town meetings. They do it all the time. They know what the public is going to rail against. This is not the first time they've done this. So I think you got to keep all that in mind too, that they're not just going to come and say, oh, it's only going to work if we put 500 or 600 units on there. They're going to know the history. They're going to know that that's not going to be worth their time to even waste 2 seconds on. So just an extra thought on that. So.
Thank you for your responses. I did vote to buy the land, and I appreciate your answers. It is a majestic property, and it'll never, if it's done right, it sounds okay. If it's not done right, it'll never be the same. So, and I think you're all in it passionately to make sure that whatever it becomes, it's right. Thank you.
From 1964 to 1979, 15 years it took the town of Cape Elizabeth in Maine to designate Fort Williams with the Portland Headlight as a park. So it took them 15 years, so I guess we're at least 4 years in.
You're not suggesting we try to break some record here, are you?
But beautiful pieces of land nonetheless. Just some observations on somebody who's been here for 3 years, and I was glad to hear someone who's been here less time than me speaking tonight. In the past 4 to 5 years, I guess we've seen some changes in terms of the 40B. You know, Mr. Harney mentioned we're very close to the 10%, as well as you know, the modular classrooms, which I appreciate you noting that, because my son's going to be in kindergarten next year, so that's a prime. You know, we're starting our life here in Medfield, so that's a prime concern for us, and I know Dr. Marston's working hard on that. Just another comment too about the actual uses that have kind of sprung forth in the last few years, and just maybe thinking about addressing those in terms of the school buses being parked out front, the police force using the site for some training activities, and obviously the mountain biking, which Gus, you've been to and have seen the guys falling off their bikes and hurting themselves. And then I guess just, you know, other things to echo what folks have said. I know that we're working on the water availability, and I know Randy, you had mentioned that from the water and sewer, that they're working on that from the warrant committee meeting the other night. I know that's something they're going to explore for this article. Joanna and Martha Fessa had done a good job looking at that, but there was still some more work to do. And then I guess too, a big question I had that I don't know that it had come up tonight, maybe it had, was the bringing the water and the sewer to the site. And I think that to me is an important factor to factor in with whether it's going to be one or multiple developers, and how you're going to kind of, you know, marshal them together, or just have one to do that in terms of that part of it. And I know I saw the Monte Carlo analysis and it looked good for the town, 2 to 2.5 million, but for the developer it was, you know, iffy depending. So I guess, you know, just thinking about those things, about how maybe we can continue to use this as a little bit of a slush fund bank for some land, which we've had uses come up where we needed. And I don't know if Dr. Marsden has another plan for the buses, but I know the folks over by Hinkley Pond don't want them back there, so, you know, a lot of good work's been done. I can't say whether or not, I mean, I certainly don't want 200 more kids in the schools. Being a younger parent moving here, you know, for the quality of the schools, I don't want an influx. It's not going to happen immediately. I have no idea how quickly this will be developed. But I think factoring in, you know, maybe even having, you know, talking about flexibility with the developer, having some flexibility with folks bringing some other concerns to the table. You know, the town meeting's coming up here. I don't know if you can really even do that, but there are some other issues that, you know, I'd just like to hear if there's thoughts about that, or if that's even known, what might be done with some of those things. So, thanks.
Jerry Potts, still at 7 Curve Street. So there are two people in town, Bill Mazzaro and John Arney, I probably have more respect for than anyone for everything you've done in town, and I seldom disagree. But I do on this, and only because I think we're confusing two distinct steps. If this zoning that we're voting for leads to a proposal to take that entire west slope and make it all housing, I'll be the first to line up and vote it down. If this goes from 300 to 500 units, 600 units, I'll be the first one to line up and vote it down. What I see here is a multi-phased, multi-year plan, which probably honestly will take 10 to 15 years to implement. So I don't think 200 kids are going to show up day one and override the schools. I think this is a plan that anyone who looks at it rationally would say would take a number of years to develop. And in the meantime, adding value. So I look at the cultural and the community center and the work that Jean Minio's doing to make that happen, and she's done an amazing job so far of building that. I think that adds huge asset, is a huge value to the town of an amazing building, the chapel, and the surrounding area for the arts. To me, it seems like a balanced plan. We might go out to developers, and what comes back is the worst nightmare, and I would be the first to vote it down. But the one thing that I noticed, and I attended almost every single one of the sessions, is there was almost, and you know, I know, Gus, you had said this, that 3 years ago when we asked the town, they had a list of things, and the master plan 4 years later came back and said, same things. To me, that shows the town actually has a lot of agreement on what this property should be. It should be special, it should be valuable, it should be balanced, it should have open space. I think this on paper does it. Until we actually go out and vote the zoning to get proposals back, I don't know what we're rejecting, because it's all theoretical. So Bill might be right, and I'll buy you a beer, Bill, or a beverage of your choice. If it's 500 units and we're there, we'll buy the beer together and we'll get our torches and say no. But we don't have that data yet. And I just want to get good, real data. I've seen, Pat, how many models did you run? Do you get paid by the model? I mean, hundreds and hundreds of, you know, what ifs that until we actually go out to the market. And the last thing I'll say on it is, I'm not an economist, but we're 13 years into an economic recovery, 12 years, depending on where you want to start. It's not going to get easier to do this. We're dealing with the lowest interest rates we've seen in decades. Now is a time to go out and kick the tires and come back with a proposal. And if we get 3 or 4 years out and we have a recession and we haven't taken this opportunity, then we owe this town an apology, because we have an asset that we're just watching diminish, or at least not even getting a price. To me, it's like on Channel 2 when you see someone, you know, pull out something from their garage, and it's, you know, and have no idea what it's worth. Oh, this is $7.8 trillion, right? I have no idea what the value of this is going to be, but the longer we just have meetings and another proposal and another thing we ask Pat to do, it's all just conjecture until we start moving. So I'm voting on this enthusiastically because I want to see what the possibilities are, and I'd like to make an educated decision on it. But it doesn't mean that I support this final thing, because I have no idea that's what's going to come back. So,
Thanks, Jerry. John? I think, John, you're the last one.
Great.
Unless I hear, what, is there somebody else still? I think you're the, all right, this will be the last call. Declare yourself now, or else we're going to close this out.
Well, I'm about the last one out of the hospital
You're
every
next to
night.
last one.
So, John Thompson, 10 Emerson Road. I want to dispel some of the fear that I'm hearing around building condition and the future and the cost to the town to maintain and stabilize these buildings. I don't know a single ridgepole in any building that is compromised at this point and in any sort of imminent danger of roof collapse. Not in a single building. I've been in every building multiple times from top to bottom. I've been in the buildings with architects who are amazed at the strength of the rafters, the ridges, and the way they were constructed in 1896. These buildings are constructed of 10 by 10 Douglas fir from the West Coast. They're pinned with steel, and they're extremely strong. And if you don't believe me, go out and look at the roof lines. Look at how straight and square they are. The slate is 120 years old, and it covers 90% of the buildings. Holes that are not in the valleys, holes on the sides of the roof, do not significantly compromise the interior of the buildings. The problem comes in some of the valleys, but those don't cause imminent roof collapse. I have no real stabilization money for the buildings, and even if this passes, we can't let the buildings sit idle without any form of ongoing stabilization cost. Right now, buildings 24, the chapel, building 27, the cafeteria, building 5, the former untidy ward, building 7, the former overflow ward for men, and building 2 had almost $500,000 spent inside the building by 20th Century Fox for stabilization. They've already been largely stabilized as part of the movie work. Paramount Pictures spent probably close to that when they did Shutter Island. And so there are sources of revenue there to help with the stabilization because they can't film in an unsafe building. But my estimate was somewhere near $1 million to, or $800,000, I think. I'm still working on the time of how you would space that out to stabilize the building. But it's not insurmountable. But I think the buildings deserve some form of ongoing stabilization. There's no one out there with hammer and nails right now, every day, working on these buildings. I have no fund for that. I have a fund of money that was created right now from revenue, from movie revenue, and I think we can add to that so that the cost to the taxpayer right now, I think, has been a pretty good bargain so far. And I don't want the town to feel this fear of imminent failure of any of these buildings. Some of them do need to come down. The tuberculosis cottage, for instance. I don't believe that's contributing to the mass historic value, so that could come down. The greenhouse, it's the size of a garage. It's not a big building. I've held off on doing work on Building 27, the former cafeteria, because the town hasn't told me whether that building should survive this plan. Why should I spend money on the roof if it doesn't survive the plan? But we still have to maintain the buildings and provide some form of stabilization. But I don't think it's some sort of financial deal killing, and that the town and people can't continue to use this as a recreational property like they use any other recreational property. I mean, my sister broke her arm on a property in the wintertime, and recreational property that had no buildings on it at all. She slipped on ice. Was it the duty of the state to make sure there was no ice on the trail that she walked on? No, it's recreational. You pass at your own risk. And I think there are statutes that protect the town from someone getting hurt in recreational property. So I think we should seriously consider what we are going to do, whether this passes or not, to mothball and maintain these buildings until whatever their next use is. And I hope that we take our time to determine what that will be, and that we don't get into a situation where we're at the whim of a developer. I've done big construction projects for Avalon and Toll Brothers. I've been their environmental consultant. So I know the kinds of things that they do and ways that they make up money for the things that they have to pay for. And what I really don't want to see here is more than the number of units that's specified here, because I think that's a real detriment to the town. I don't think that intersection at Starbucks and Route 109 can withstand 200 more cars every morning at that red light. Thank you.
We have one more? Nope. Will you allow substitute for that one? Come on, Mary.
All righty. Mary Garnett, 123 Granite Street. And again, thank you, everyone, for all of your efforts. I have a big question I'd like to ask. We're talking about the Medfield State Hospital property and all that we would like to look forward to there. But we don't mention anything else that's going up in town, and that will take money. Things that are being built on 27 right now. I mean, I can leave 109, I can leave CVS in the morning, drive home, turn on South Street Extension, and pass 130 cars just to get to Rocky Lane. And that's because people let me get in. More people are coming from Walpole. I'm on Granite Street, and I'm already experiencing traffic coming from Walpole on Granite Street because of the construction that's going on now down in Walpole. We're going to have some overflow from construction that's going other places. So as much as this is a wonderful idea, we still have water issues, or we're talking about water issues, but it's going to be when more construction is done in the town. I guess what I'm trying to say is, I'm not feeling like dots are being connected. This isn't just an isolated situation. I mean, if this is all done, is something else going to be affected that's being constructed? I mean, where the Legion is, or where the construction is going on now where Kargh is, I don't know, it's just not the only thing that's being constructed in town that we're looking at. And I realize it's going to take many years, but I think we have a lot of things that we should be, I just don't hear anything else. This is the one thing you're working on, but it's not the only thing that we're all going to be affected by. Is that clear?
Commercial for the townwide master plan.
Pardon me?
So there is on October 20th, not to add another planning session for you to go, but there is a townwide master planning process that's kicking off on October 20th.
I was reading about that.
And
I can stand up and talk about it then again too?
And everything else, higher taxes, Dale Street, all of these things, putting something together with a long-term plan. The other thing about the state hospital master plan is we asked them to do everything. Fix 40B,
oh my gosh.
keep open space.
That's what I'm saying, it's a
without
great
a
job.
townwide plan.
But
so anyone who's concerned about the townwide plan, the starting process on the 20th, please come out 5 to 7. Meals will be served, music will be played, plans will be drawn. It's a great event. Child care provided.
I just want all of the town to be happy, not just this particular.
Okay, I hereby declare this discussion closed for the night. I'd like to thank all of you. I'd like to thank everybody that showed up. We had about 100 people by my rough count. I would particularly like to thank those of you who stuck it out till 10 past 10 in the evening, and appreciate the spirited discussion. We're going to get to that special town meeting on November 18th, and we're going to get either a confirmation that what the Master Planning Committee was asked to put together, that people think that it's the right thing and they want to proceed, or we're going to get an answer that they don't want that, despite the discussions that have gone on for 4 years. Speaking for myself, of all the things that where my positions are, and the reason why I pushed for a November 18th special town meeting is because we would be having this exact same conversation a year from now. And so I want to know. We need to figure this one out, and we need to go fish or cut bait.